Story 1. The sky was a churning mass of gray, thunder rattling the glass as I pulled the hearse out of the garage for what should have been a simple midnight transfer. Rain fell in sheets, hammering the pavement, blurring the city lights into soft halos. It was the sort of storm that soaks through to your bones, the kind that makes even the most routine drive feel haunted. I was already uneasy, my hands cold on the wheel, but the work was the work, and I tried not to dwell on the weight in the air. The deceased was a man with no family at the service. A closed casket, no flowers, just paperwork and silence. I noticed it first on the outskirts, where the city gave way to fields and winding asphalt. The rain crashed down around me, but as I glanced in the side mirror, I saw something that didn't fit. A clear, dry strip running directly behind the hearse. The slick black of the storm-swept road broken by a line of untouched asphalt. At first, I thought it was a trick of the headlights or my tired eyes, but every time I checked, the road beneath the car remained perfectly dry, as if the storm was parted just for me. I drove on, the windshield wipers flailing, but the road immediately in front of and behind ours stayed untouched by the downpour. At the next intersection, the street lamp overhead flickered and died, leaving the world muffled and dim. I slowed to a crawl, the silence inside the cabin somehow growing thicker, more oppressive, as if the rain was beating against the world, but not against me. Even the engine noise seemed subdued, swallowed by the hush that traveled with me through the tempest. The other cars I passed were soaked, their wipers struggling, but when I pulled up alongside one at a red light, I caught the driver's confused stare. They too had seen it, the strange envelope of dryness that followed the hearse like a shroud. By the time I reached the funeral home on the far side of town, my nerves were stretched taut. The rain continued its furious assault, but the moment I stepped out, umbrella ready, I found the ground beneath my feet bone dry, the drops curving away as if I carried an invisible shield. I stood there, chilled despite the stillness, and looked back along the route I'd driven, a single, unbroken path of dry pavement twisting through the wet darkness, leading all the way back to the edge of the city. In the distance, thunder echoed, and I shivered not from the cold, but from the growing sense that I had carried more than just a body through the storm. That night, I told myself it was a fluke, some odd trick of weather or luck. But as I drove home, every glance in the mirror showed that same line of dry, silent road following me through the night, and I knew something had begun that could not be explained or ignored. After that first strange night, I couldn't shake the memory of the dry road, though I tried to bury it under routine and reason. Yet the phenomenon only grew more obvious with each passing day. Every time I took the hearse out, especially when that same casket was inside, the sky seemed to respond, clouds rolling in with a gravity that pressed on my chest, rain descending in torrents, but always stopping just short of touching the vehicle. The effect was uncanny, unmistakable. The drops would bead and swirl across the windshield, but if I watched closely in the rearview mirror, I saw the water split, forced aside by some invisible hand. It was as though the world itself refused to touch what I carried. Inside the car, the silence became even more pronounced. The gentle drumming of rain, so constant and comforting in the background of a storm, was utterly absent. There was no sound but the engine and the faint creak of the casket straps. It was an unnatural stillness, as if the hearse were moving through a vacuum, each rumble of thunder muffled before it could reach me. The sensation was so intense that at times I caught myself holding my breath, afraid that even my heartbeat was too loud for this peculiar sacred hush. Word began to spread among my colleagues. On one route, a fellow driver passed by and later asked, with a nervous half-smile, why my hearse and the road under it were dry, while the rest of the funeral procession was drenched. At the next funeral home, a pair of groundskeepers eyed the vehicle warily, whispering to each other when they saw that not a drop marked the coffin lid or the roof of the car. Even family members started to notice, peering curiously through the rain, some crossing themselves, others just shaking their heads in disbelief as they stepped through puddles toward a casket that seemed immune to the weather. I started to dread the rain, the way the air would thicken and the world outside would blur, while my small universe remained untouched and silent. With every trip, the effect seemed to intensify, the rain curving more sharply away, the quiet growing deeper and heavier, until it felt less like protection and more like isolation, a boundary drawn not by nature, but by something older, something that did not want to mingle with the living world. Friends and strangers alike began to ask questions, but I found myself without answers, only an ever-deepening sense of unease. The silence beneath the raindrops became my companion, haunting the miles and hours, and I wondered, with growing dread, what it was the storm was trying so hard to avoid. It didn't take long before other signs began to manifest, subtle at first, then more and more impossible to ignore. The animals were the first to notice. Stray dogs that normally roamed the outskirts of the cemetery would freeze as I drove by, heads lowered, eyes fixed on the hearse as it passed along its dry corridor. Deer that should have bolted from the headlights simply stood at the edge of the woods, unmoving, as if transfixed by the silent, rainless bubble that surrounded the car. Even the crows that haunted the telephone wires would fall silent and watch, never cawing or taking flight until I had disappeared around the bend. At every crossroads, old roadside shrines and weathered wooden crosses seemed to tilt in my direction, turning by unseen hands so that they faced the passing cortege. Flowers left for lost souls would sway toward the hearse, untouched by wind, as if offering one last tribute to the passage of something neither living nor quite dead. The world on either side of the road felt strangely suspended. A hush would fall over fields. Street lamps would dim and gutter, and once, at the very edge of town, a stoplight flickered and went out the moment I rolled through the intersection, leaving the world awash in an unnatural twilight. My nerves began to fray. Sometimes, while idling at a red light or crawling through the city at dusk, I'd see figures on the sidewalks, pause and turn, following the progress of the hearse with solemn, almost mournful faces. They never waved, never spoke, just stared in silence until I'd vanished into the mist and the soundless stretch of dry asphalt behind me. Other drivers in the procession began refusing to follow too closely, whispering among themselves that it wasn't right. No car, no matter how well maintained, could part the storm in that way. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere thickened with every mile. The silence was not just the absence of sound, but a presence in itself, a weight that pressed against my chest and made each breath feel borrowed. The casket seemed heavier than before, the air around it growing colder, so cold my fingers would numb on the steering wheel, even when the heater was turned all the way up. I tried to tell myself it was all coincidence, tricks of the mind and weather, but the evidence stacked higher each night. Silent animals, turning crosses, a hush that hung over the world like a curtain, drawn against something none of us were meant to see. More than once, as I drove through the strange, untouched corridor, I thought I felt eyes on me, not just from the living, but from something waiting at the boundary between rain and dry, between this world and the next. It was as if death itself was opening a path, clearing the way for something unfinished, something that would not let the earth or the storm lay claim to its secret until its story was done. Unable to live with the relentless quiet or the unearthly phenomena shadowing every stormy drive, I became obsessed with uncovering the story behind the man in the casket. His name appeared only briefly in the logs, a faint scrawl beneath columns of more ordinary records. No relatives had come to claim him, and no one from the funeral home seemed to remember much, just that he'd arrived late, that there was no service, no flowers, and the burial order had been hastily signed by a city official. Still, as I dug through faded files and city archives, a pattern emerged. Wherever this man's body was moved, the rain would falter, and the silence would gather around whoever performed the duty. Haunted by each journey, I searched old addresses and tracked down what few fragments of the man's life I could. There was a faded obituary, A single line in the back of the local newspaper. He leaves no known family. All inquiries directed to city records. But deeper in the archives, behind crumbling microfilm and outdated ledgers, I found something more. A decades-old letter to the editor, unsigned, pleading for justice for the forgotten brother, buried far from home. The handwriting was urgent, the words tinged with heartbreak. He always said he feared the earth would reject him if he wasn't returned to his family's plot. Please, if you can, bring him home to rest with us. A chill ran through me as I realized the significance of every dry mile and silent interval. The road would not welcome rain. The dead would not rest until the man's final request had been honored. All those years of storm and stillness were a message, a warning, a plea from the other side for something left unfinished. I understood now that the dry road was more than an oddity. It was a boundary, an interruption, a sign that death itself was waiting for a promise to be fulfilled. Each time the casket moved, the world withdrew, refusing to close over what had not yet found peace. My part in this was no accident. The silence, the unnatural calm, was an invitation to uncover the truth and bring an end to the restless passage. I knew then that unless I could see his wish through, the storm and its silence would haunt the roads forever, and no funeral in my care would find its way home. The answer became clear. I could not ignore the plea of the dead, not if I ever hoped to silence the storm that followed me. I took it upon myself to honor what had been denied. With the evidence in hand, the forgotten letter, the traces of the man's origins, the details long abandoned in city records, I arranged, through quiet persistence and a string of long, awkward calls, for his casket to be transferred one final time. I drove north, away from the city's tangled streets, and toward a distant cemetery that overlooked a family homestead, where wildflowers grew and the land rose gently toward the sky. It was raining when I left, a steady drumming that promised to soak the earth clean. But as I reached the city limits, the familiar silence descended. The rain parted, leaving the car and casket untouched, the road behind me stretching in a ribbon of black glass through the countryside. The world seemed to hold its breath, every living thing pausing as if to witness what I carried. Not even the wind disturbed the grass along the shoulder. The sky was split clouds and shadow behind, sunlight and calm ahead. At the graveside, I stood alone with the casket and the letter, reading the plea aloud under a sky that seemed to wait. I spoke the man's name, told him that his journey was finally over, and asked forgiveness for all the years spent in silence and displacement. As I finished the words, I laid the letter atop the coffin, and for the first time I heard it, the gentle patter of rain beginning to fall, first a whisper and then a cascade, drenching the casket, the soil, and me. The silence was broken, not by dread, but by relief, nature reclaiming what had finally been surrendered, the world restored to its rightful balance. As I drove away, soaked to the skin, I watched the rain streak the windows and felt a peace I had not known in months. The road was wet, unremarkable, just another path home. The hearse was ordinary again, no silence, no eyes watching, no unnatural boundaries to keep the living and the dead apart. From that day forward, whenever storms threatened and funerals called me out into the night, the rain fell as it should, the world noisy and alive, the dead content to rest at last. The drought was over, and the long silence between worlds had been healed by a simple act of remembrance. Story 2. The shift ended as most of mine do, alone, in the silence that follows a midnight funeral, with the scent of cut flowers clinging to the upholstery and the distant echo of grieving voices still ringing in my ears. I was tired, a little numb, and eager to hand in the keys and slip out into the cool night air. I did one last sweep of the hearse habit, more than anything. A look in the back, a glance at the dashboard, a check of the glove box for any overlooked paperwork or stray memorial cards. That's when I saw it. A small piece of paper, wrinkled and creased as if it had been balled up in someone's fist, shoved deep into the corner of the glove compartment. At first, I assumed it was trash or a forgotten receipt. But when I unfolded it, the hairs on my arms stood on end. It was a note, written in shaky, old-fashioned handwriting, a script that looked oddly familiar from the forms I'd handled just hours before. The message was simple, but urgent. Beware the next left after the bridge. Danger ahead. No signature. Just those words, and a feeling of cold dread curling in my gut. I almost laughed it off, suspecting some tasteless prank from a coworker or a relative still raw with grief. But the unease gnawed at me. I took a different route home that night, circling around the old bridge instead of crossing it, feeling silly but oddly relieved. The next morning, I woke to news of a landslide blocking the exact road I would have taken a chain of smashed cars. Emergency lights flickering in the dawn rain. The bridge collapsed and impassable. I felt the world tilt a little beneath me. The warning had been real. All day, the note burned a hole in my pocket, the tremble in the handwriting lingering at the edge of my thoughts. The name on the forms from the night before kept returning. Mrs. Margaret Ellison, age 82, elegant cursive in the registry, her story ending on a rain-soaked Tuesday. I told myself it was coincidence, a stray detail, a trick of fate, but something inside me had changed. I started checking the glove box after every funeral, half hoping, half dreading what I might find next, wondering if the dead really did have one last message to share, and if I was now the only one left to listen. I began to approach each new transport with an edge of anticipation and dread, hands trembling slightly as I opened the glove box after every long, lonely drive. At first, nothing, just registration papers, a spare pair of gloves, maybe a faded parking stub. Then, after the third night, another note appeared. This time, the handwriting was different, larger, bolder, but equally familiar from the signature I had seen on the embalming authorization that very evening. The message was unsettling. Don't trust the nephew. He's lying about the will. No names, no context, but I remembered the grieving young man from the funeral, his nervous glance, the tension in his voice as he argued quietly with a lawyer in the rain outside the chapel. I dismissed it as coincidence, but a week later, gossip trickled through the staff. The nephew had been caught trying to forge documents related to the estate, a bitter family fight erupting just as the note had suggested. That was when the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every time I handled a new case, every time the casket was loaded and the drive completed, I found a new slip of paper, each one written in the same uncertain hand as the deceased. Some were warnings: check the gas line before you leave, scribbled the night a faulty hearse nearly caught fire. Others revealed secrets that should have gone to the grave. There's a letter hidden in my sewing kit for my daughter. Please give it to her. And I, compelled by a force I didn't fully understand, found myself tracking down the family, delivering the forgotten message as if it were my own duty. Sometimes the notes were gentle, apologies for old arguments, confessions of love never spoken aloud. Sometimes they were sharp as broken glass blame, guilt, pleas for forgiveness, tiny windows into the fears and regrets that lingered after death. Each one left me more shaken than the last. I started keeping the notes in a small box under my bed, unable to throw them away, unable to explain to anyone else what was happening. People around me began to notice that I was distracted, a little haunted, carrying burdens that weren't my own. I avoided talking about the glove box, about the growing pile of secrets, but I couldn't stop myself from reading each note as soon as I found it, drawn in by the mystery and the melancholy, by the hope that somehow I was helping these restless souls find peace. And still, after every funeral, I opened the glove box with a mix of fear and longing, never knowing what I might discover next, only that I was no longer alone in the silence that followed the dead. By the time the fifth note appeared, I couldn't dismiss any of it as coincidence. I began to keep a ledger, listing the names of the deceased, the date of their final ride, and the contents of each message. It became a nightly ritual. I'd drive in silence, feel the weight of the casket behind me, and then, at journey's end, brace myself for the quiet moment when I'd open the glove box and find a new slip of paper, sometimes already yellowing at the edges, always written in the unmistakable script of someone newly gone. It was only when I started comparing the handwriting on the notes to the signatures in our funeral home's files that I realized how precise and impossible the connection truly was. Each warning, each confession, matched the handwriting of the person whose body I'd just delivered. The shaky curls of an elderly woman, the block letters of a retired sailor, the left-leaning slant of a nervous teenager, lost too soon. Every note bore the same flourishes and flaws as the forms they'd signed in life. The content, too, became more urgent. No longer just secrets and regrets, but pointed warnings about the business itself. Don't let them take the shortcut through Mill Road. Someone is waiting in the shadows. Or watch for the car with broken headlights. It's not what it seems. The details were always specific, the timing uncanny. I started heeding every note, no matter how outlandish. I warned my coworkers about routes, checked under the hood for tampered wires, quietly intervened when I heard rumors of theft or dishonesty among the staff. A creeping dread took root inside me. It was as if I'd become a conduit, a postman between two worlds, my hands the last to touch these messages before they slipped back into the silence. The rest of the staff began to talk, how I always seemed to anticipate trouble, how funerals on my watch rarely saw mishap or confusion. Some said I was lucky. Others, those who noticed my pale face and tired eyes, whispered that I was haunted. And yet, no matter how fearful I became, I could not turn away. The glove box was a kind of oracle now, a secret mailbox for the unfinished stories of the dead, and I felt compelled to protect the living from whatever dangers or truths came scrawled in trembling hands. As the warnings grew more frequent, I realized there was a pattern to their urgency, a shadow lurking at the edge of every funeral, a danger only I could see if I kept reading, kept listening, kept delivering each secret to the world of the living. I began to trust the notes as much as my own instincts, even when their messages seemed cryptic or impossible. The warnings came closer together, the handwriting sometimes nearly illegible with haste or fear. One night, after a long and uneasy drive through the outskirts, I found a note folded so tightly it was hard to open. The words inside were urgent, the pen pressed deep into the paper. Don't stop at the gas station. Keep driving. Danger. I didn't need further convincing. The sky was heavy with clouds, the roads slick with rain, and the streetlights flickered overhead, as if shuddering from the same cold I felt inside. The usual route home took me past a lonely service station, a spot where drivers often paused for coffee or a quick break before the final leg. I nearly missed the turn, muscle memory urging me toward the familiar glow of neon, but the memory of all those trembling signatures in the box was stronger. I forced myself to keep going, pulse racing, eyes glued to the rearview mirror. I passed the station just as a commotion erupted. A figure darted across the forecourt. Headlights swept through the dark, and the sound of shattering glass echoed behind me. Later, I'd hear on the news that a robbery had turned violent at precisely that moment, leaving the unlucky witnesses shaken and in need of ambulances. If I'd stopped, I might have been caught in the middle. I might have become another story, whispered through the city streets. After that night, the whispers around the funeral home changed. Colleagues watched me with a mixture of wariness and respect. A few began to approach me quietly, asking if I'd noticed anything strange about their own recent cases, if the messenger in the glove box had left something for them too. But it was always me. The notes kept appearing only in my car, the warnings growing more insistent, the secrets more pointed. I became something of a talisman protected, some said, by the gratitude of the dead. Others, less kindly, said I was cursed, marked for the in-between. Despite the fear, I felt a strange sense of purpose. For the first time, my work was more than ritual and routine. Every journey was a vigil, every note a chance to tip fate in the right direction. And when danger crept close again, I listened, acted, and watched disaster pass by. It wasn't luck. It was something older, stranger a burden, and a calling I could neither refuse nor explain. The notes had saved me, and now I understood. It was my duty to listen for every voice that still needed to be heard. It was after a winter funeral, the kind where breath fogs the air inside the hearse, and everything feels heavy and final, that I found what I knew would be the last of the notes, at least for now. The drive back was uneventful. The casket had been delivered to the family, and I had taken the long way home, unable to shake the habit of scanning the rear view, bracing for a warning or a whisper. When I parked in the garage, I sat for a long time with my hands on the wheel, uncertain if I wanted to see another message or finally be left alone. But the glove box called to me, as it always did. I opened it, and there, resting atop the pile of registration slips and spare pens, was a single slip of paper. The handwriting was delicate, a little shaky but clear, signed at the bottom in a flourish that matched the name I had recorded in the ledger just hours before. The message was simple. "Thank you for listening. You kept me safe. Please keep listening for us all." A warmth flooded through me, strange and bittersweet. I realized then that my part in all this was neither curse nor blessing, but a quiet responsibility, one I'd never asked for, but could no longer abandon. I was the bridge now, the messenger between two worlds, trusted with the last requests, the unfinished confessions. The warnings meant to tip fate away from tragedy. Each note had been a plea to be heard and remembered. Each secret passed from the dead to the living through hands that would not judge or forget. Since then, the glove box has not been empty for long. Sometimes days pass with nothing but the hum of the engine and the weight of memory. Other times, a new message waits in the darkness, offering comfort, apology, or warning. I carry the notes with me, tucked in my pocket, filed away in my mind, always listening, always ready, knowing the job is not just about the road ahead, but about giving the silent one last chance to speak. And as I drive through the city's quietest hours, the snow and the rain, and the night pressing close against the windows, I remember that every journey is a crossing, every silence a conversation waiting to be heard. I am the messenger now, and my promise is simple. As long as the glove box opens, I will never stop listening. Story 3. It was late, the kind of night where the city seems to close in on itself, leaving only the hiss of tires on wet asphalt and the hum of the engine for company. I'd done this route 100 times. Pick up the casket, make the slow journey to the funeral home, and try not to think about the weight in the back. The air inside the hearse was thick with the scent of lily and polish, a kind of sterile quiet that pressed against my thoughts. I tried to focus on the road, on the passing streetlights, on anything but the fact that it was just me and the dead man behind me for miles. It wasn't until I stopped at a red light, one of those old, lonely intersections with a single flickering lamp overhead, that I saw it. I checked the rear view, mostly out of habit, and froze. For a split second, the reflection in the mirror didn't match what I knew to be true. The casket was closed, the lid screwed tight, but there, in the shimmering dark, I saw a face. Not just any face's face, the man whose name I'd read on the tag, whose family had wept just hours earlier. His eyes met mine through the mirror, and there, unmistakably, was the faintest curve of a smile. I blinked, heart pounding, and forced myself to look again. This time, there was nothing but my own pale, startled reflection and the gleam of the casket's brass. I told myself it was a trick of the light, fatigue, nerves stretched too thin by too many late nights and too many silent passengers. Still, the sensation lingered. The rest of the drive, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not with malice, but with a kind of patient amusement. I kept glancing up, half expecting to see that smile again. When I finally pulled into the garage, I sat for a long moment with my hands on the wheel, staring at the empty mirror. The feeling of being observed clung to me like a second skin, making the hairs on my neck stand up even as I stepped out into the cool air. I went home and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that impossible, subtle smile, the kind that meant something, though I couldn't yet say what. I told myself it was nothing, just another ghost story for the late shift. But deep down, I knew better. The dead had found a way to look back, and something about that smile was just the beginning. The days blurred into one another as funeral followed funeral, each drive a slow procession of headlights and hush. Yet after that first sighting, I could never quite bring myself to forget the smile in the mirror. The next time I took a night shift, I forced myself not to look. My eyes stayed on the road. My hands gripped the wheel with an anxious tension. But human curiosity is a stubborn thing. At the third red light, I glanced up. There he was again. This time, the smile was unmistakable, a little wider. The lips parted just enough to reveal teeth. The casket in the back was sealed, undisturbed, but the reflection showed a face that didn't belong to me, watching with a glee that was almost playful, almost hungry. The pattern took hold quickly. With every new ride, the smile grew more pronounced. At first, it was just a twitch at the corners of his mouth. Then, as the nights wore on, it became broader, more insistent, as if the dead man behind me was delighting in some private joke only he understood. I started to dread the fall of night, the moment I'd be alone again on empty streets, knowing that no matter how tightly I kept my eyes on the asphalt, eventually I would have to check the mirror for traffic, for my own safety, for reassurance that I was still alone. But I never was. Even in daylight, even with other drivers close behind or beside me, I felt the weight of his attention. In quiet parking lots and deserted highways, I would feel that smile stretching across the miles between us. Sometimes I'd catch the reflection, even when I wasn't in the hearse, just the memory of it, flickering at the edge of my vision as I washed my hands in the staff bathroom or stared into the blank glass of my phone. I stopped telling people about it after a while. The first time I did, my coworker laughed and said I needed more sleep. The second time, she frowned and changed the subject. It became a kind of secret, a private haunting. The smile was no longer faint or ambiguous. It was wide, confident, and deeply wrong, an expression too alive, too knowing for the dead. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered if the casket even needed to be there, or if the reflection would follow me no matter what, grinning wider and wider with every drive. Every glance, every moment I refused to look away. The sense of being watched grew into a sense of being pursued, until I could hardly tell if I was driving the dead or if he was driving me. One long, never-ending smile stretching between the world of the living and whatever waited just beyond the glass. Night after night, the ride became a battle between habit and terror. My every instinct urged me to keep my eyes down, to treat the rearview mirror as if it were nothing more than a piece of black glass. But duty and the inescapable need to know always drew my gaze back. At first, it was the familiar shape of mouth, stretching wider, lips drawn so far they threatened to tear. But soon the reflection became unmoored from reality. No longer did the face wait passively for my attention. Instead, it pressed closer, features warping with each drive, the smile spreading until it filled the entire mirror, blotting out even the faintest trace of the casket or the darkness behind it. The first time it happened, I nearly crashed the car. I checked the mirror at a stoplight and saw not the road behind, but an entire pane of grinning teeth, lips drawn thin, eyes gleaming with a feverish light. The dead man's face, distorted and enormous, occupied the whole surface, as if the glass itself had become a window into something deeper, a place where the boundaries of flesh and bone, of living and dead, no longer applied. The smile pulsed with a kind of mocking energy. I jerked my head away, pulse racing, heart in my throat, but even in my peripheral vision, I could sense it there, stretching wider, the grin now alive and writhing, hungry for my fear. It got worse. Some nights, the reflection would appear, even when I glanced at the side mirrors or caught my shadow in a storefront window. The face's face was everywhere, its smile growing so wide it threatened to split the world in two. Other drivers, sensing my distraction or my dread, began to keep their distance. I stopped taking night shifts, but it didn't matter. The smile followed me into the daylight, flashing in sunlit puddles or in the rear view of my own battered sedan. At home, in the dark, I dreamed of mirrors, of rows of teeth that bit into the silence until I woke up gasping. I started to realize the smile wanted something. It was more than a haunting, more than a ghostly prank. The smile was a message, a warning or perhaps an accusation, and with each night that it spread across the glass, I felt myself being drawn into its meaning. I no longer recognized my own reflection, only the wide, eager mouth of a man who refused to stay buried. A smile that promised there would be no rest until I understood what kept it alive. The car was no longer just a hearse. It was a moving stage for a drama I hadn't chosen, with the mirror as its spotlight, and the smile as its only actor. By now, my nerves were shredded, sleep a distant memory, every reflective surface a trap. A smile was inescapable, and its persistence felt more purposeful with every mile. Driven by dread and a desperate need for answers, I began to investigate the man whose face had invaded my every journey. His name at first was just another entry in the registry, a line of script on a death certificate, a tag on a sealed casket. But I dug deeper, poring through public records, old obituaries, news clippings lost to the back pages. It didn't take long to find hints of a story never resolved. The dead man, Samuel D. Fisher, had lived quietly on the city's edge, with no known family left to mourn him. But the more I uncovered, the stranger things became. There were whispers of a business deal gone wrong, accusations of betrayal and fraud, a neighbor's tragic accident that was never fully explained. One article from a decade earlier caught my eye, a grainy photograph of Samuel, unsmiling, beside a younger man who had vanished under suspicious circumstances. The police closed the file. The community moved on, but the bitterness lingered in every mention. I realized then that the smile wasn't just a ghostly taunt, it was a demand. Each time I met that ever-widening grin in the mirror, I felt a pulse of urgency, a hunger for attention, for justice, or maybe even revenge. The smile had never belonged to the Samuel in the old photos. It was something new, twisted by years of silence and secrets left to rot in the dark. It wanted acknowledgement. It wanted the truth to be spoken aloud. Night after night, I replayed every detail, searching for what Samuel needed from me. In my dreams, the face in the mirror began to mouth silent words, pleading or accusing. I couldn't tell which. The smile was no longer merely frightening. It was pleading, insistent, full of a grief that had curdled into something monstrous. I understood, with a chill, that the only way to banish the smile would be to bring the truth of Samuel's life and his unresolved death into the light. Armed with what I'd found, I prepared to confront the reflection one final time, determined to break the cycle that held us both captive. The smile was waiting, wider and sharper than ever, as if it knew the end or the beginning was finally near. That last drive felt different from the start. I took the hearse out alone, the casket in back, and a heavy manila envelope on the passenger seat, a dossier of every secret I'd uncovered, every buried truth that had twisted the face in my mirror into a mask of mockery and longing. The night pressed close against the windows, headlights dissolving into fog, but my focus was fixed on the glass. No more avoidance, no more desperate glances away. Tonight, I would face the smile, whatever it meant, and see it through to its bitter end. It appeared almost instantly, shimmering into being as soon as I rounded the first corner out of the city. The mouth was impossibly wide now, stretching from one edge of the mirror to the other, lips pulled taut over perfect, two white teeth. Samuel's eyes found mine, their depths swirling with accusation and grief, and I felt a chill pass through me, as if every secret I'd uncovered now weighed on my soul as much as his. The smile began to move, lips forming silent words, pleading for something I could only guess at. Acknowledgement, repentance, release. I pulled the hearse to a stop in the empty lot behind the funeral home, engine idling, rain whispering against the roof. I took the envelope in shaking hands, flipped on the dome light, and read aloud everything I'd learned. the wrongs never righted, the accusations ignored, the tragedy left unspoken. My voice trembled, echoing in the hush. "You were wrong, Samuel," I said at last. "The truth is out now. You're seen. You're not forgotten." For a long moment, the smile did not change. Then, so slowly I almost missed it, the lips softened, the cheeks relaxed. The grin shrank until it became merely a mouth, then a line, then nothing at all. The eyes closed. My own reflection returned pale, exhausted, but finally alone. The air in the car shifted, a sense of pressure dissolving like mist at sunrise. I sat there, watching the empty mirror, barely daring to breathe. There were no more smiles, no more eyes following me from the glass. Only silence, deep and gentle, like a grave finally filled in. I knew that I had broken the cycle, set us both free not through force or denial, but by facing the truth and granting it space in the world of the living. When I left the car that night, the rain had stopped. The world felt changed. The city no longer crouched in shadow. I walked home beneath a sky washed clean, knowing that if I ever saw a smile in the mirror again, it would be my own. And that, at last, was enough. Story 4. It was a night so dense you could feel it pressing against the glass. The kind of darkness that made every mile crawl and every minute stretch. I'd been driving the hearse for hours, the dead weight of the casket and back growing heavier with every passing turn. Fatigue nipped at the edges of my vision, and when the GPS on the dashboard chimed with a new, rudest shortcut, it promised, shaving 30 minutes off my journey. I barely hesitated. I glanced at the map. A thin gray line appeared, cutting through country I didn't recognize, but exhaustion drowned out caution. I tapped accept and let the car glide off the main road, tires crunching from smooth asphalt to a narrow, muddy track hemmed in by wild, overgrown grass. The headlights carved a tunnel through the brambles. There were no road signs, no mailboxes, not even the ghostly reflection of a street name in the rain. Cell service vanished almost instantly, my phone screen slipping into no signal as the outside world fell away. The road, if it could even be called that, wound deeper into the woods, and soon I lost all sense of direction. The trees pressed close, branches scraping against the doors, the scent of wet earth and old leaves thick through the cracked window. Each bend in the trail felt like a test, the woods crowding tighter, my eyes straining for any sign of civilization. I tried to tell myself it was fine. GPS glitches happened. Backroads sometimes slipped through the cracks of memory and mapmakers. But there was a stillness here that didn't belong, an emptiness that gnawed at my nerves. The forest seemed untouched, undisturbed by any traffic but mine. Even the insects had fallen silent, the chorus of crickets and frogs replaced by a heavy, listening quiet. Every so often, I glanced at the casket in the mirror, half expecting movement, half hoping for some reassuring sense of reality, but the only thing that looked back was my own pale, anxious face painted in blue dashboard glow. The shortcut dragged on, the minutes lengthening. I kept waiting for the GPS to reroute or for a familiar intersection to appear, but nothing came, only more trees, more turns, more of that hush that pressed in like a shroud. I told myself to relax, to keep driving, that I'd be back on paved roads soon enough. But deep down, a chill was settling in, a feeling that I'd crossed a line into a place I was never meant to find. And as the night closed tighter around the car, I realized the shortcut was leading me somewhere I could not name and would not easily escape. The further I drove down that impossible road, the more the air changed, growing colder and strangely heavy, as if the woods themselves were watching every jolt and shudder of the hearse. The GPS screen flickered and died, its light going blank, leaving only the wavering glow of my headlights to cut through the thickening dark. The path narrowed until it felt like the trees were bending in over the roof, their branches rattling like skeletal fingers against the metal, and every instinct in me screamed to turn around, but there was nowhere to go but forward. That's when I saw the first lantern. It hovered between the trees just off the shoulder, an old-fashioned glass lamp, its flame steady and unnaturally bright despite the wind and rain. I slowed, squinting through the glass, and then saw another, and another. One by one, lanterns blinked to life all along the edge of the woods, forming a silent procession that paralleled my route, their light shifting and swaying in a rhythm too coordinated to be mere wind. I told myself they were hikers, campers, pranksters, anyone but who they really were. But the woods were too deep, too wet, and too far from any trail for that to make sense. The whisper started quietly, almost hidden beneath the noise of the engine and the rain tapping the roof. At first, I thought it was the wind. Then the sound grew sharper, clearer, a chorus of urgent voices rising and falling just out of sight. I heard my own name, or something close to it, murmured from the blackness. And other names, strange words, and snatches of prayers that made no sense, but crawled under my skin like cold hands. The voices moved with the lanterns, pacing the car, drawing closer, the volume swelling each time I hesitated or pressed the brakes. Panic clawed at my chest. Every instinct told me to keep my eyes on the road, to avoid looking too closely at the woods. But curiosity and fear are twin blades. I risked a glance through the passenger window and saw silhouettes, half-glimpsed shapes in the brush figures carrying the lanterns, faces lost in shadow, moving with an eerie, weightless step. They never fully emerged from the dark, but I could feel them, dozens of them, tracking my progress, their attention growing sharper with every foot I advanced. I gripped the wheel tighter, desperate for the first sign of an intersection, a mailbox, anything human. But the whispers grew louder, their words blending into a strange, relentless litany, echoing up from the roots and the wet soil. It was as if I was driving through a borderland, caught between the world I knew and one that had been waiting for someone foolish enough to take this road. With every passing minute, it became clear. I was not simply lost. I was being herded, watched, and warned. And every lantern and whisper meant I was venturing deeper into a territory where the living had no right to be. Every nerve in my body was raw, straining to hear past the engine's steady growl and the pelting of rain. The deeper I pressed into the woods, the more those lanterns multiplied, forming rings of light that seemed to float ahead of me, guiding and warning at once. My world narrowed to the rhythm of my own breath and the shadows slipping between the trees. The road itself became a winding ribbon, hemmed in so tightly by gnarled roots and moss that it barely seemed real. I tried to remember how far I'd driven, how many turns I'd taken, but time stretched and curled back on itself, the miles impossible to count. The GPS, long dead, was now just a dark square on the dash. My phone showed only a black void of no service. In the growing hush, the voices outside became clearer, no longer just whispers, but distinct, rhythmic chanting, as if the woods themselves were reciting some old ritual or prayer. Through the crack in my window, I heard my name again, and the names of the dead, perhaps even the name of the person in the casket behind me, intoned in a cadence that made my skin prickle with horror. The further I went, the more the path closed in, branches arching overhead until even the faint moonlight was blotted out. The lights in the woods formed a circle now, boxing in the car, and as I crept forward, they swayed in unison, lanterns bobbing to some silent command. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of peat and old leaves, and the chanting rose to a low, thrumming hum that filled my chest with a terror deeper than words. It was in that moment, with the car barely moving and the voices echoing just inches away, that I realized what I had done. This wasn't just an unmapped shortcut or a forgotten road. This was a boundary, a border between worlds, and I had driven a funeral procession into a place that did not belong to the living. The lanterns were not simply watchers, but sentinels, keeping vigil over ground that had been sealed and claimed long before my headlights cut their way through the dark. I wasn't sure if I had crossed a line, or if the line had risen up to meet me, but every part of my being knew I had trespassed And now I was at the mercy of whatever kept watch over the Forbidden's earth. The voices pressed closer. The road all but disappeared under a carpet of drifting fog, and I felt the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes waiting for me to choose to stop, to flee, or to accept that I had entered a place where the living are only tolerated until the dead remember their rules. I gripped the wheel, heart pounding, waiting for a sign, a command, or an escape. But the woods gave nothing but silence, lantern light, and the sound of my own fear roaring in my ears. I didn't know when the mist first began to creep in, only that it was suddenly everywhere, thick and cold as a shroud, swirling low over the hood and filling the cabin with a clammy chill that sank deep into my bones. The headlights were useless now, swallowed by a wall of fog that rolled off the ditch and across the dirt road, reducing the world to a circle barely wider than the car itself. Beyond that ring of weak yellow light, the lanterns glowed brighter than ever, their bearers pressing closer, shadows lengthening and faces remaining just out of sight. The chanting gave way to a rising tide of whispers, urgent and desperate, tumbling over one another until they seemed to fill the car, the forest, and my own mind. The road behind had disappeared, erased by the mist and by the ranks of silent watchers. I tried to turn around, but the wheels spun helplessly in the soft earth, and the fog pressed in even tighter. My chest grew tight, breath short, as I realized there was no path forward, no path back, only this pulsing, haunted limbo. That's when a single voice rose above the others, not angry, but pleading, heavy with sorrow and warning. "Go back before it's too late," it urged, the words clear and sharp, as if spoken from the back seat or the grave itself. "Turn around, leave what you've brought. Leave this place. Go while you still can." It was the first time any of the voices had addressed me directly, and the sound cut through the fog like a blade. I stared into the rearview mirror, expecting to see a face behind me, his face, or the faces of those holding the lanterns, but all I saw was my own reflection, ghostly and drawn, eyes wide with dread. The air inside the hearse felt heavy, too, as if the dead themselves were waiting for my choice, their judgment suspended in the thick silence. I hesitated, hand hovering over the ignition, the urge to escape warring with the instinct to listen. The plea came again, softer now, as if drifting away. "Leave this road. It does not belong to you." My heart pounded as I glanced out the window. The lanterns were so close, I could see the shapes of hands, the glint of eyes in the darkness. I realized then that every second spent in this place risked losing something, my way, my passenger, maybe even my soul. Steeling myself, I slammed the hearse into reverse and twisted the wheel, praying the tires would catch on something solid. The engine growled, the car jerked, and I felt the thick mud give way beneath me. As the wheels found purchase, and I lurched backward, the voices swelled in a sudden, desperate crescendo, some cursing, some crying, some still begging me to leave. Through the fog, the lanterns scattered and danced, flashing like distant lightning, as I fought my way back to the main road. The last thing I heard before the mist broke was the same voice, now barely more than a whisper. "Remember this, and do not return." With trembling hands locked on the wheel, I floored the accelerator, the hearse careening blindly through the thinning fog as the last of the lanterns flickered and disappeared among the trees. The road behind me felt alive, closing up as soon as my tires rolled away, swallowing the shortcut back into darkness and memory. The headlights at last caught the familiar glint of pavement, and with a lurch, I crossed back onto the main road, the GPS chiming uselessly, as if the route had never changed at all. The silence that followed was total. No more voices, no lantern light, only the hum of the engine and the rush of my own panicked breath. I glanced in the rearview mirror again and saw nothing but darkness and the pale outline of the sealed casket. The oppressive weight that had filled the car since the woods began to dissolve, replaced by a cold emptiness that left me shaken and unsteady. I drove in that silence for miles, headlights slicing through a landscape that seemed suddenly washed clean, the world outside reassuringly ordinary and mundane. But when I finally stopped, exhausted, beneath the bright fluorescent lights of the funeral home garage, I noticed something that made my skin crawl all over again. There on the side of the car, streaked across the mud-spattered paint, were long, thin smears, as if dozens of hands had clawed at the hearse as it fled. On the windows and the rear doors, faint marks remained, impressions of fingers, swirls of dirt, and the ghost of a palm pressed flat against the glass. Inside, I found a single clump of black earth on the passenger floor, damp and cold, with the faint scent of moss and old decay. I said nothing to my coworkers. The shortcut was gone from the GPS. The woods would not let themselves be found again. But that night, before I left the garage, I caught one last glance in the mirror. For just a heartbeat, I thought I saw lantern light reflected there distant, blue and gold, like a procession still searching the night. And beneath it, a warning in silence. Some roads were never meant for the living. Some borders are guarded by more than trees and shadows. And if you cross them, you may bring something back, if only the memory and the mark of those who watched you run. Since that night, whenever I drive alone through unfamiliar back roads, I feel the urge to check the GPS twice. I listen for voices in the dark, and if I ever see lanterns swinging in the woods, I don't slow down, and I never, ever take the shortcut. The dead keep their secrets, and the living are wise to leave them be. Story 5. The night was colder than most, the kind that settles deep into your bones and makes every breath feel heavier. I'd driven the route 100 times before, but this time there was no family following, no weeping relatives at the curb, just me, the hum of the engine, and a body in the back that no one had come to claim. His name was written on the tag Walter Harlan, but it meant nothing to anyone at the funeral home, and less to the world outside. I tried not to dwell on it as I pulled into the lot behind the city morgue, ready to lock up and call it a night. I shifted the hearse into park, reached for the key, and twisted. Nothing. The engine sputtered, but the key wouldn't budge, stuck firm in the ignition, as if welded in place. I wiggled it, tried again, leaned in harder, sweat beading on my palms despite the chill. Still nothing. I muttered a curse under my breath and jiggled the steering wheel, remembering old tricks my father taught me. But the key didn't move an inch. The minutes crawled by. I checked my phone, but the battery was low and the screen flickered uselessly. No signal down here anyway. With a sigh, I tried once more to force the key, then gave up and sat back, staring into the dark lot. It was then I noticed a faint mist creeping along the ground outside the car, and for a second, it looked almost like fingers stretching over the pavement, reaching toward the hearse. I didn't want to admit it, but a shiver crawled up my spine. The radio, silent all night, crackled to life on its own, a burst of static, then a distant voice, too faint to make out. I reached to turn it off, but the dial spun on its own, flipping through stations in a frantic staccato, each one a little colder, a little stranger than the last. The cabin temperature dropped suddenly, my breath frosting the inside of the glass, and in that eerie quiet, I thought I heard a soft, almost pleading whisper from the back seat. I told myself it was exhaustion, nerves, a trick of isolation. But no matter how I rationalized, the key stayed stuck, the hearse held in place by some force I could not name. And in that moment, with the dead man's name echoing in my mind and the chill tightening around me, I knew this was no ordinary mechanical failure. Something was waiting, watching, and would not let me go until it got what it wanted. The night pressed in closer, every minute ticking by with the steady drip of dread that comes when the ordinary turns against you. I tried everything I could think of to free the key. At first, it was simple things: wiggling the steering wheel, pressing the brake, shifting in and out of gear. When that failed, I pulled out my phone flashlight and peered into the column, searching for any sign of debris or damage. I fetched my pocket knife from the glove box and tried to pry at the edges, but the key was locked tight, cold to the touch, almost as if it had fused with the metal beneath it. Frustrated, I called dispatch for help, but the line only buzzed and popped, my words lost in a static haze. Eventually, another driver showed up, flashlight bobbing as he circled the hearse, eyes narrowed with confusion. He tried everything: pliers, lubricant, a few forceful yanks, but the key didn't budge. Even a pair of mechanics, called in on a favor and eager for overtime, could do nothing. It was as if the ignition itself had become a sealed vault, and we were intruders with no hope of cracking the code. The longer I sat trapped in that car, the stranger things became. The radio flickered on again, cycling through stations, this time settling on bursts of static, broken by the faintest hints of music-old hymns, warped and stretched, barely recognizable. The temperature dipped so low I could see my breath, even as sweat clung to the back of my neck. Each time I thought about leaving the car, about simply walking away, the engine coughed and trembled, the dashboard lights flashing in a rapid, anxious pulse. Then, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to move through the vents and upholstery, coming from every direction at once. Sometimes it sounded like my own name, spoken in a voice I almost remembered. Other times it was just a soft, persistent urging: stay, listen, finish what was left undone. By the second hour, desperation had curdled into fear. I knew, with a certainty deeper than logic, that no force or tool would free that key. The car had become a prison, holding me until I unraveled the message left behind by the body in the back. It wasn't about metal or mechanics. It was about memory, about something unfinished and overlooked. The whispers were waiting, patient but insistent, and the only way forward would be to understand what they wanted from me. Desperation makes a person receptive to things they would otherwise ignore, and as the hours dragged on in the hearse, I found myself searching for anything, a sign, a clue, some gesture that would break whatever had locked me in place. My breath clouded in the frigid air as I rifled through the glove compartment and under the seats, hoping for a lost tool or hidden fuse. But it was when I turned to the back, sweeping my flashlight across the empty rows, that I noticed something odd wedged between the cushions. A small, crumpled piece of paper, yellowed and brittle, as if it had been waiting there for years. Hands shaking, I smoothed it open. Written in faded blue ink was a single phrase: "Don't forget the penny for Walter." For a moment, it meant nothing: a scrap, a joke, maybe a coincidence. But the name matched the one on the toe tag of the unclaimed body. Beneath the phrase, barely legible, were instructions: place a coin on his chest, say his name, and wish him peace. At first, I hesitated. Rituals and superstitions had always been part of this Job's folklore, whispered in break rooms or after a rough night. But tonight, with the car cold as a crypt and the key still stuck fast, I was in no position to doubt. I dug through my coat pockets until I found a battered penny-old Lincoln staring up at me, tarnished and dull, and walked to the back. I paused over the casket, whispering Walter's name aloud, feeling the syllables hang heavy in the cold air. My voice trembled as I wished him peace, laying the penny gently on the polished wood. The moment I did, a hush fell over the hearse. No more static, no more whispers, only the sound of my own heartbeat. I waited, breath held, as if expecting some grand sign. Nothing moved, nothing spoke. But when I turned back to the front, the key, which had refused every trick and every tool, slid easily from the ignition, cold but free. I sat in stunned silence, penny still pressed between my thumb and forefinger, the reality settling in like fog at dawn. It hadn't been strength or cleverness that freed me. It was a gesture, a ritual, a recognition of someone forgotten, a final kindness for a soul left unclaimed. The rules had changed, and now I understood. Sometimes, the only way to move on is to remember those who can't. For a long moment after the ritual, I sat behind the wheel, the copper penny cold against my palm, waiting to see if the spell would hold. My breath lingered in the air, the hush in the hearse so complete, I could hear the tick of the dashboard clock, counting the seconds that stretched between one world and the next. Slowly, as if waking from a dream, the car seemed to thaw. The radio, which had been cycling through ghostly hymns and static, clicked off with a final, gentle sigh. The lights on the dashboard stopped flickering. The air grew warmer, almost inviting, as if the presence that had haunted the space was finally ready to let go. I closed my eyes, and as the note had instructed, whispered Walter's name one last time. Walter Harlan. Rest in peace. My voice sounded steadier now, less like a plea and more like a promise. I felt an easing in my chest, the tension that had gripped my body for hours finally releasing, as though I had unknotted some invisible tie that held us both in place. When I reached for the key, I barely needed to touch it this time. It turned easily and slid out of the ignition, as if nothing had ever been wrong. The relief was overwhelming, a silent blessing that swept through the hearse and settled over the casket in the back. For a moment, I thought I heard the faintest echo of gratitude in the quiet. A soft, "thank you," carried on the cold air, but it could have been my imagination, or just the sound of the world righting itself. As I gathered my things and stepped into the night, I looked back at the car, half expecting some new sign, some message scrawled in the condensation or etched into the glass. But the hearse was just a car again, ordinary and still, and the city lights in the distance felt brighter, more welcoming. I pocketed the penny, promising myself I'd never forget the lesson of that night. The rules of the living and the dead had brushed close, and respect simple, quiet, and honest had proved stronger than any lock or chain. From that moment on, I knew that my job was more than transport and paperwork. It was remembrance. It was care for those who had no one left to care for them. And for as long as I held the keys, I'd never let another name go unspoken, nor another soul be left without the dignity of a last, gentle farewell. The days that followed carried an unexpected lightness, as though a shadow I'd been carrying for years had finally been set down somewhere quiet. The hearse, once an extension of every burden and secret I'd ferried through rain-slick streets, now seemed only a vehicle, no more, no less. Still, the memory of that night clung to me like a scent, subtle and persistent, shaping every small ritual I performed at work. Every time I was called to transport an unclaimed body, I felt that old chill return, but it was gentler now, tempered by understanding. Before each drive, I would check the name on the tag and whisper it softly, sometimes 3 times, sometimes just once, as if introducing myself to someone about to disappear. If there was time, I'd leave a coin, a wildflower, even a torn scrap of ribbon, resting it on the casket as a simple sign of remembrance. I noticed that, since that first ritual, the car never troubled me again. The key turned smoothly, the engine hummed without complaint, and the air inside the hearse remained still and neutral, never cold, never charged with those invisible expectations. My coworkers, when they heard the story in bits and pieces, chalked it up to nerves or superstition, and I let them. But I knew something had shifted in the balance between the world of the living and that patient, waiting silence beyond the grave. On certain nights, when the moon was high and the streets were empty, I'd catch my own reflection in the windshield and see not just myself, but 1,000 silent witnesses' names half remembered, stories almost lost, every unclaimed life waiting for acknowledgement. It made me careful. It made me grateful. And above all, it reminded me that respect for the forgotten is not an empty gesture. It is a bridge of fragile, vital act that keeps the peace between the past and the present, between the restless dead and those who carry them home. So now, whenever I slip the key from the ignition at the end of a lonely journey, I pause. I say thank you. I promise not to forget. And the car and the night and the unclaimed soul behind me are at peace, at least until the next name, the next coin, and the next story that needs to be heard. Story 6. It started like any other night behind the wheel, the city asleep outside, and the world distilled to the steady hum of tires, dashboard lights, and my own breathing. The shift was always longest, between 3 and 5 a.m. hours, where the streets felt endless and time itself slowed down. I'd just finished dropping off at the last mortuary and was heading back along empty avenues, radio low, windows fogged with the quiet condensation of winter. I was alone, or at least, I thought I was. I noticed the seatbelt first. There was a sharp, metallic click from the back seat, startling in the hush. Glancing in the rear view, I saw the passenger side belt in the back row pulled tight, locked into place, the tongue perfectly slotted in the buckle, as if someone had just fastened it for a ride. But the seat was empty, just the gray upholstery, shadowed by the glow of the street lamps outside. Nothing and no one to claim the safety of that strap. My first instinct was to laugh it off, to tell myself it was some glitch, a loose mechanism jostled by a bump in the road, or maybe the last passenger hadn't clicked it back after a routine cleaning. Still, it was unsettling, the kind of detail your brain refuses to let go. At the next red light, I reached back and unbuckled it, letting the strap snap back into place. Problem solved, I thought, and continued on. The rest of the night passed in silence. But the next night, as I finished another long loop through silent neighborhoods, the same thing happened. The seatbelt in the back clicked shut on its own, crisp and unmistakable in the stillness. This time, I checked every lock, every door, convinced a prankster was hiding in the shadows, or that one of the guys at the home was messing with me for kicks. There was no one, just my reflection in the mirror, tired and a little spooked, and the seatbelt drawn tight across empty air. Night after night, the pattern repeated. Sometimes the belt would be buckled before I even started the car. Other times it would snap shut halfway through the shift, the sound echoing in the close space. I began to anticipate it, waiting for the moment when the silence would break, when the car would acknowledge a presence that wasn't mine. I unbuckled it again and again, but it always returned faithful, inevitable, the ritual of an invisible passenger claiming their place. I tried to rationalize it, blamed it on cold weather, old springs, tricks of the mind. But the unease grew, a chill settling deeper each night, as if the car itself was holding its breath, waiting for a journey it couldn't finish alone. And that was only the beginning. As the nights passed, the phenomenon took on a pattern, a rhythm that settled into the routine on my solitary drives. It became more than just the sound of a seatbelt clicking shut. The car began to feel inhabited, as though the air in the back seat grew denser with every mile. It was subtle at first, a sense of weight shifting behind me when I turned a corner too sharply, or the faint creak of the upholstery in an otherwise empty vehicle. But soon, the evidence became impossible to ignore. On a particularly cold night, after the belt had clicked into place yet again, I stopped beneath a street lamp and glanced back. In the glow of the orange sodium light, I saw something that made my skin crawl. The faintest indentation pressed into the fabric of the rear bench, right where the belt crossed the seat. It wasn't deep, but it was there, shape and size perfectly matched to a passenger's weight. I ran my hand over it, feeling the dip in the material, but it smoothed out instantly, springing back as if whatever had pressed it was only barely tethered to the world. The real terror came with the fog. Late one night, with the heater running and the city lost in darkness, the windows began to mist up from the inside, glass clouding with each breath I took. But then I noticed a second pattern on the back window, away from where I sat. A patch of condensation cleared itself, and then slowly clouded again, as though someone had exhaled long and slow onto the glass. My heart hammered as I watched the mist swirl, the shape of a handprint appearing, then fading, a single palm and 5 delicate fingers etched in cold breath. Other signs followed. On the coldest nights, the air in the car would drop suddenly, a chill settling over my shoulders and creeping up the back of my neck. Once, after leaving the car for a quick break, I returned to find the back door slightly ajar and the seatbelt buckled again, tighter than before. And sometimes, in the static of the radio or the hush before dawn, I could swear I heard a sigh barely there, a whisper lost in the hum of the road. I started to dread the shift's end, that stretch of highway where I'd find the belt once more, locked and waiting. Every time I'd unbuckle it, only to feel the weight of unseen eyes on the back of my head. It was as if the car was caught between two worlds, carrying more than just the living. And every cold breath, every invisible hand, every crease in the seat reminded me that some passengers take the journey night after night, longing for a ride that only the dead can finish. What began as an unsettling quirk soon became an obsession. I started keeping track of the time, making mental notes of when the seatbelt clicked into place, always close to 3:17 a.m., a witching hour that seemed to own the back seat of my hearse. Each repetition grew more deliberate, as if the presence had settled into its own routine, waiting for the precise moment in the quietest part of the night to take its place. The marks on the seat grew more distinct with each passing shift, so much so that the fabric seemed permanently etched by an invisible weight. I'd smooth the upholstery after every ride, but by the next morning, the same slight hollow reappeared, deeper, heavier. The car itself took on a different feel after midnight colder, the radio sometimes blaring static for a second or two, or the dashboard lights flickering, as though jarred by a sudden movement in the back. I changed routes, tried earlier and later shifts, even switched vehicles once, but the phenomenon followed me. Always the rear right passenger seat, always the belt clicking shut. On a Tuesday, I watched the seatbelt pull tight by itself in the rearview mirror, the motion slow and smooth, as if guided by a careful, unseen hand. The sight froze me. Then the window fogged in a perfect oval, just where a face might hover, and I caught the shape of a breath, a patch of clear glass, then a swirl of mist, then nothing. The presence was becoming bolder. Some nights, I'd hear a gentle tap from the back seat, rhythmic and faint, not quite in time with the bumps in the road. Once, while waiting for a red light, I saw the rear seatbelt buckle move on its own, then settle, as if someone was shifting their weight for comfort. I felt the air stir behind me, a faint rustling like the brush of a coat or the faintest whisper of fabric. By now, I had stopped telling myself it was a mechanical issue. There was a ritual in the repetition, a longing in the chill that settled over the back seat, a hunger in the way the fog clung to the glass. Whatever was happening, it had purpose. It was as if, each night, something returned to claim its place, determined to be acknowledged, determined to finish a journey that no living soul could understand. And every time the clock drew near that haunted hour, I gripped the steering wheel and braced myself, waiting for the click that meant my invisible passenger had come aboard again. The cycle became unbearable, a nightly haunting that left me anxious even before dusk. I needed to know who or what was riding with me. With sleep nearly impossible and my nerves shredded, I started digging through records at the funeral home, piecing together every file connected to that particular car and route. Old logbooks, service notes, and faded printouts piled across my kitchen table, each detail a potential key. It didn't take long to spot the pattern. Years earlier, on a bitter winter night almost to the day, a tragic accident had claimed the life of a young woman. She'd been transported alone, late at night, in the very car I now drove, her destination a cemetery on the edge of town. The records were sparse, no next of kin, no mourners at the burial, only a name, Emily Grant. I found the detail that broke the spell of reason entirely. A single, handwritten notation on the burial record passenger seatbelt, fastened by driver before departure, remained buckled upon arrival. The realization hit with the cold weight of inevitability. The rear right seat, the precise timing, the insistence on being acknowledged. It all pointed back to Emily, her last ride unfinished, her final comfort the ritual of a seatbelt clipped shut for a journey no one else remembered. The more I learned, the heavier the atmosphere in the car grew. It was as if my research itself called her closer, as if my need to understand was feeding her determination to be seen. I tried to talk to her quietly when I was alone. I said her name aloud on those haunted drives, a trembling invocation in the dark. Each time, the chill in the car would deepen. The window would fog and clear. The seatbelt would snap shut with a swiftness that felt like relief. And though I never saw her face, not in mirrors, not in the rear view, not even as a shadow, I sensed her gratitude, a subtle warmth that sometimes followed the cold. But it was never enough to end the ritual. The seatbelt still buckled, the marks still appeared, the breath still fogged the glass, until I could find a way to offer closure, to finish the journey she'd never completed. I knew the haunting would continue each night, the car waiting, the hour approaching, and the invisible passenger always ready to ride. I knew by the end of that long week what had to be done. No more ignoring, no more pretending it was just a glitch of steel and fabric. That final night, I prepared as if for a ceremony. I cleaned the car, polished the windows, and placed a single white Lily Emily's flower, according to the archives, on the back seat, right where the indentation always appeared. I started my shift with a quiet resolve, whispering her name as I turned the key. Emily Grant, you're welcome to ride with me tonight. Let's get you home. The city seemed to move in slow motion. Streetlights stretched thin in the rearview mirror, fog curling up from the pavement. As the clock ticked closer to 3:17, I felt the familiar drop in temperature, the faint whisper of breath behind me, the almost expectant hush in the cabin. But this time, I didn't flinch. I glanced back, and the seatbelt pulled itself tight, just once, then settled into stillness. The Lily trembled, as if in a breeze that only she could feel. I drove the route of her last journey, following the old records exactly through winding streets and quiet, sleeping neighborhoods, past the hospital, down to the cemetery on the edge of town. All the while, the car remained hushed, the air tense but peaceful, the kind of peace that comes with endings. When I parked at the gates, I whispered a short prayer one I remembered from my grandmother, and unclipped the seatbelt myself, leaving the flower where she'd always sat. The fog on the window cleared for the first time, not with the shape of a hand or a breath, but as if the glass itself had been polished by sunrise. Driving back to the garage, the car felt different, lighter, as though I was alone for the first time in weeks. The cold was gone. The seat stayed smooth, and the seatbelt hung open, waiting, but not for her. I finished my shift in silence. No clicks, no chills, just the quiet relief of a burden finally set down. But I learned something that night, a lesson I carry with me on every lonely drive. Now, whenever I slip behind the wheel in the blue hour before dawn, I glance at the back seat, say a name if I know it, or offer a flower if I don't. The car stays calm, and I stay vigilant, understanding that every soul deserves a safe journey home, and that sometimes the smallest act of remembrance is enough to let the past rest at last. Story 7. It began on a night like any other. A routine shift hauling the last coffin from a hospital basement to the city's oldest graveyard. I remember the soft static on the radio, the taste of cheap coffee gone cold, the glow of traffic lights blinking through an empty downtown. My GPS chirped directions, a familiar route, a series of turns I'd traced 100 times before, streets whose names I could recite in my sleep. The city outside was asleep, draped in fog and sodium vapor, the distant hum of a train, the only break in the hush. But somewhere after midnight, as I crossed a quiet intersection and turned down a street I didn't remember choosing, the world seemed to slip sideways. The map on my screen spun, recalibrated, then simply froze. I shrugged it off. At first, old cities are full of shortcuts and detours, and construction often meant last-minute changes, even for funeral traffic. Yet every turn I took, every side street I tried, brought me past the same faded laundromat, the same boarded-up barbershop, the same stray cat watching from the alley with moon-yellow eyes. The roads twisted and looped back on themselves. Street signs flickered in and out of view, names sometimes legible, sometimes smudged with rust and age. The more I tried to find my way out, the more I circled back to a narrow, sloping avenue I'd never seen before, one lined with leafless oaks, their branches arching overhead in a Gothic vault. The air grew thick, damp, and sour, as if it had rained hours ago, and nothing had dried since. At the end of that street stood a pair of iron gates, tall as a house, webbed with rust and green with moss, shut tight except for a gap, just wide enough for a car. I slowed to a crawl, headlights sweeping over the crumbling stone columns on either side. Above the gates, a plaque. The letters were old, flaked to the point of unreadability, but the date 1899 stood clear in the gloom. My hands tightened on the wheel as I rolled to a stop in front of the gate. The engine idled, the dashboard glowed, but the rest of the world was still, heavy, almost expectant. I tried to back up, to turn away, but the car seemed to resist, as if the tires were caught on something invisible. The radio, which had been a constant companion, faded to silence, and for the first time that night, I realized I couldn't remember how long I'd been driving, or even which neighborhood I was in. It was then that I saw the old man. He stood just inside the gate, back hunched, hair white and wild, his long coat buttoned up to his chin, despite the mildness of the night. He watched me in silence for a moment, eyes pale as smoke, then shuffled forward, resting both hands on the iron bars. I reached for the window switch, hesitating, unsure if this was a trick of exhaustion or some lost soul looking for shelter. The man's voice carried across the space, thin but clear, not quite echoing, not quite a whisper. "Have you any word of the burial?" he asked, and his question sent a chill up my spine. "The burial of Thomas, my boy, have you seen him?" I started to answer, "No, sir. I don't know Thomas. I'm just doing my rounds," but the words stuck in my throat. I glanced at the GPS. Blank. I looked at the clock. It flickered between midnight and 1 o'clock, refusing to settle on either. The old man waited, eyes never leaving mine, a patience in his stance that felt endless, ancient. I tried to drive away, tried every trick I knew, but the engine stalled, the lights dimmed, and the car would not move. No matter how many times I circled the block or changed direction, every road led back to that gate, that figure, that single question repeated in the hush. "Have you any news of Thomas?" Around me, the city was gone, just this place, this moment, this endless, rusted vigil. And the knowledge settled in my bones, heavier with every hour. I would not be allowed to leave until the old man had his answer. Time began to stretch, elastic and strange. As I sat there in the dim glow of the dashboard, headlights pointed at those iron gates. The engine's idle fell silent, battery drained by a cold that didn't match the weather. Outside, the city was nowhere to be found, no sound of traffic, no flicker of distant windows, just the rustle of wind through dead branches, and the steady presence of the old man framed by the twisted ironwork. He didn't move at first, simply stared at me with a searching intensity, as if he was peering through fog, memory, and even the years themselves. I pressed the window button, and after a moment's delay, the glass slid down with a sigh. The air outside was sharp with the scent of iron and rain, thick with an ache that had nothing to do with time. "Have you any word of the funeral?" he repeated, voice neither pleading nor angry, but insistent, like a clock that cannot forget to strike the hour. "Of Thomas, my son?" His hands trembled against the bars, the knuckles pale and skin stretched thin by age and waiting. It was a question I had no answer for, but I tried anyway, fumbling for something that would satisfy both of us. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm just a driver. I don't." The words fell flat, lost in the space between us. He shook his head with the slow, resigned patience of someone who has heard every excuse. "They promised he'd be brought here. They promised a headstone. Have you seen the stone? Has he come home?" I looked past him, straining to see through the bars into the darkness beyond. The shape of a graveyard waited there, just visible in the weak beam of my headlights. Stilted stones, some broken, others half buried in weeds, a landscape of neglect. My hands were sweating despite the chill. The cargo in my own car, a coffin ready for burial, felt suddenly heavier, as if the weight of every unspoken promise pressed down on the roof and axles. "I haven't seen anyone, sir," I said, forcing the words through the thick air. "There's no Thomas on my route." "Are you sure?" His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in a kind of deep, exhausted disappointment. "He was buried here 100 years ago, this very night. I have waited every year, every passing driver. Always the same question, always no answer. They never brought word. They never finished his grave. The repetition of his grief cut through me in a way no threat or warning ever could. The car felt more and more like a trap. Every attempt to reverse, every push of the accelerator, brought me only a few feet from the gate, where the old man's face would loom, more sorrowful each time. He asked again, softer, "If you see him, tell him his father waits. Tell him I am still here." When I tried to drive off, one more attempt, one more turn, one more route, the streets twisted and blurred, always bringing me back to the rusted gate, the tired, expectant figure, and the same question hanging in the fog. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, or maybe years. It no longer mattered. The old man, his vigil, and the weight of an unfinished story became my world, closing around me as tightly as those iron bars. I understood then that escape wasn't possible, not until I could find an answer, or carry word from the graveyard itself. A message left, a debt finally paid. The gate remained locked, the night endless, and the old man, a patient sentinel against forgetting, would not let me go until I helped him find peace. The city seemed to dissolve whenever I tried to leave that iron gate behind. I would attempt new routes with each new dawn, sometimes convinced I'd finally found the right street or a familiar landmark, only to round a corner and see those rusted bars, the peeling date above them, and the old man in his battered coat, waiting. The rest of the world blurred at the edges, time and distance losing their meaning. My life narrowed to a single question that I could neither answer nor escape. Desperation is a sharp and restless thing. I began to wonder if there was something I could do, some way to break the cycle that now held me tight. I left the car parked before the gate and walked into the fog one night, shoes scraping gravel, the chill of the air laced with a grief I could almost taste. The graveyard behind the gate was vast but neglected, stones toppling and names erased by moss and water. I searched, hour after hour, for any sign of Thomas, reading every name, brushing away leaves, kneeling in mud, searching for clues that would please the silent sentinel at the gate. I returned to the funeral home during the few hours each day the city seemed to exist, searching archives and old records. I found a stack of brittle death certificates and faded funeral ledgers, their ink blurred by time and tears. The story began to reveal itself. A boy named Thomas Fisher, buried in 1899 after a tragic accident at the mill. His father, Henry, had paid for a grand stone and a family plot, but the records ended abruptly. There was no signature confirming the grave had been completed. No one had visited in generations. No one had tended the ground or offered a flower since the funeral. Local lore, preserved in yellowed newspaper clippings and whispered among the older cemetery staff, told of a scandal. Funds for the burial had gone missing. The stonecutter who promised to finish Thomas's monument vanished before the work was done. Henry Fisher had returned night after night and year after year, pleading with every undertaker, every driver, every soul who passed that iron gate for news. No word ever came. Eventually, the old man faded from life and memory, but his vigil remained, a sorrow so strong it had become a fixture in the fog, waiting for someone to finally carry word to the other side. I copied every record, every faded letter, every rumor and legend, returning to the gate to share my findings. The old man listened, patient as the grave, as I recited dates and names, told him of the empty plot, of the promise never kept. When I finished, he only shook his head. I am waiting for the stone. I am waiting for peace. It became clear then. The cycle would only break with a gesture, a sign that the world had not forgotten Thomas, that the promise would be honored, that a father's vigil would finally end. Until then, the car would always find its way back to that gate, No matter how far I tried to drive, the city reshaping itself around the unfinished story of loss and longing. The days bled into nights, the streets outside my window growing more formless, and the routine of each shift haunted by a new certainty. It was no longer enough to gather facts or recite what I'd found. Something in this place demanded an act, a completion, a closing of the wound left 100 years before. My world shrank to the length of a single street, ending always at those iron gates. The old man fixed at his post, every line of his face carved by waiting. Every time I arrived, the ritual repeated itself. I'd approach in the car sometimes, after hours of looping through neighborhoods that had no name. Sometimes after a drive so short, I barely remembered starting the engine. Each time, the headlights found the same figure, and each time the old man would step forward, hands shaking against the bars, asking, "Have you brought news of Thomas? Has he finally come home?" His voice was not accusatory, only tired a weariness that had hollowed him out, leaving only the resolve of a promise not yet kept. I tried bringing him what comfort I could. I read the list of names aloud from the cemetery register, hoping one would ring true. I recited the dates I had uncovered in the archives, the details of the funeral never finished, the stone never cut. Sometimes he would close his eyes and listen, lips moving in silent prayer, but every time I finished, the gate remained closed, the car unable to leave. He would repeat. They said they would lay his stone. They said there would be a marker. Always the same hope, always the same disappointment. In rare moments, the veil between us seemed to thin. Once, I saw him look past me toward the hearse and nod, as if he recognized the shape of loss it carried. Another time, he pressed a slip of paper through the bars, a crumbling note written in a hand that trembled with age. "Please, just remember his name. That is all I have left to ask." With that, the endless cycle revealed its shape. The city, the gate, the unchanging question. None of it would yield until a debt had been repaid, not with records or apologies, but with the gesture denied to Thomas for a century. It was not just about a stone or a name. It was about a father's grief, a son's forgotten resting place, the wound of memory that outlasted even the flesh. I understood what was needed at last. The car and I would remain bound to this place, drawn always to the gate, until the promise made 100 years ago was finally honored. Only then, perhaps, would the old man's vigil end, and the streets of the city allow me to pass on into morning free and at peace. By the time the answer revealed itself, I'd lost track of how many nights I'd spent tracing ghostly routes through a city that seemed to exist only for this story. I began to prepare for the act that might end it, a gesture of remembrance, simple and honest, to fill the gap left open for a century. At the funeral home, I borrowed a single white flower and a piece of blank paper. I wrote Thomas Fisher's name in my own hand, careful and slow, whispering it aloud with every stroke. I promised, as I wrote, that he would not be forgotten again. That night, I drove once more to the gate. The streets didn't twist or resist this time. They simply carried me forward, as if the city itself had grown tired. The sky was heavy, streaked with clouds, and the air shimmered with the hush that comes just before dawn. I parked in front of the old iron bars and stepped out into the chill, clutching the flower and the note. The old man was there, waiting, his silhouette silvered by the headlights, eyes wide and wet with hope. I walked up to the gate and knelt, sliding the flower through the gap in the bars, then pressed the note after it, the letters stark against the white. I spoke Thomas's name aloud, steady and certain, then recited what little I knew: his father's love, the promise of a stone, the long years spent waiting for word. As the final syllable faded into the quiet, the old man's shoulders trembled, the weariness lifting from his frame. He looked at me, really looked, and for the first time I saw peace bloom behind his eyes, a release as profound as the ending of a prayer. The gate, which had seemed so impossibly heavy and eternal, creaked shut with a gentle clang, its rust no longer angry but at rest. The graveyard beyond glimmered in the first blush of dawn, the stones less broken, the weeds less wild. The old man's shape grew fainter in the growing light, his gratitude lingering in the air, mingled with the scent of earth and old iron. He nodded to me, just once, and was gone. I walked back to the car, the city quietly returning to itself. As I drove away, the GPS glowed steady. The clock held the hour, and every turn brought me farther from that haunted street. I never saw the gate again, though sometimes, on silent nights, I catch a glint of iron at the edge of my headlights and feel a gentle sadness, the kind that honors a promise kept. From that day, every time I passed a cemetery or iron gate, I whispered Thomas's name, a quiet memorial to the story that bound me, a way to remind the city and myself that every journey, even the longest vigil, can find its end. And somewhere, I like to believe a father and his son are finally together, their grief gone quiet, their gate rusted in peace. Story 8. The storm that night was relentless, a kind of rain that seemed to flatten the city. Water streaming down the windows in thick rivers, thunder rolling across the sky in endless waves. It was the kind of weather that made the whole world feel abandoned, as if everyone else had wisely sought shelter, leaving only the lost and the necessary on the road. I was both, I suppose, a funeral driver, ferrying a closed casket on a back road route, counting the minutes until I could finish the shift and head home to dry socks and a quiet apartment. Visibility was so poor, I had to lean forward, squinting through the blur, wipers smearing the rain rather than clearing it. My hands gripped the wheel tighter as I approached the sharp bend near Miller's Crossing, headlights catching on every ripple and shine of the waterlogged asphalt. For a moment, the only sound was the drumming of rain on the roof and the soft click of the blinker. I glanced in the rearview habit, paranoia, a tick I've picked up on too many lonely nights, and saw nothing but darkness and the faint shape of the casket in the back. But when I turned back to the road, something caught my eye in the corner of the window. Small smudges, 5 finger marks, perfectly spaced, as if a child's hand had pressed against the inside of the glass. I startled, almost swerved, and looked around in a rush of fear and confusion. There was no one in the car but me, every door locked, every window sealed tight against the storm. I told myself it was just a leftover mark, a trick of condensation, a remnant from a past transport kids sometimes ride in these cars for family funerals, after all. I grabbed a rag from the glove box at the next stoplight and wiped the glass clean, scrubbing away the evidence until the pane gleamed, my own reflection shaky in the dim light. I took a breath, laughed at myself, and kept driving. But not even 10 minutes later, as I rounded the next bend and the rain redoubled its assault, I saw them again, more handprints, now clustered on the side window and the rear windshield, all on the inside. Some larger, some impossibly small, palm prints and fingertips in watery relief, visible only when the lightning flashed. I wiped them away a second time, more forcefully, heart hammering. It made no sense. There was no one in the car, and yet the prints kept coming back, always fresh, always impossibly crisp. I kept checking the seats, the floors, the space between the casket and the wall, but there was nowhere for anyone to hide. By the time I reached the highway, the glass was marked with dozens of little hands, pressed flat and pleading, appearing faster than I could erase them. I tried to keep my focus on the road, tried to tell myself it was a trick of the weather, maybe some strange reaction between the cold outside and the heat from the vents. But deep down I knew these marks were too deliberate, too alive, and the chill that settled over my shoulders had nothing to do with the temperature. I drove on through the storm, rain beating out the seconds, my only company the small, persistent hands that seemed to want out, or in, or simply to be seen. And I had the growing sense, with every new print, that this was only the beginning. If I thought the handprints were the end of it, I was wrong. I started to notice a pattern after only a few nights. It wasn't every storm, and it wasn't every route. It was only when I took the old county road, usually because the highway was flooded, or there'd been a wreck that the handprints returned. And always, without exception, they appeared as I passed a certain crumbling building, half hidden behind a line of skeletal pines, its brick facade blackened by age, and its windows blind with darkness. The sign out front was long gone, but everyone in town still called it the orphanage. It had been empty for decades, closed after a fire or a scandal. No one seemed sure of the details. Some said it was cursed, others just forgotten. All I knew was that my skin prickled every time I neared it, even before the storms and the prints began. Now, each approach felt like stepping into a memory that wasn't mine. The wind always seemed colder, the rain harsher, and for a half-mile stretch, the world narrowed to the rhythmic swipe of the wipers and the growing sense of unseen eyes watching from the trees. The handprints would begin to appear just as the orphanage came into view, often before I realized where I was. Sometimes only one or two, delicate and half-formed, as if someone had barely touched the glass in passing. Other times, a flurry dozens of tiny palms, some smeared as if they'd tried to drag themselves across the window. I'd wipe them away, each time a little more frantic. But by the time I reached the turnoff for the highway, the glass would be crowded again, a mosaic of prints that felt more desperate than playful. I began to dread those nights, to time my routes to avoid that stretch whenever possible. But the rains kept coming, and the funeral home schedule was never mine to set. Colleagues would sometimes mention strange weather or odd feelings on that road, but no one else reported the handprints. They stayed with me, a private haunting, tied somehow to my car, my timing, my presence on that road when the sky opened and the orphanage loomed. The realization hit one night as lightning lit up the empty windows, and for a split second, I thought I saw faces dozens of children staring out, their eyes wide and silent. The prints appeared then, 5 at a time, almost as if each child pressed their hands to the glass in longing or warning. I told myself it was a trick of the storm, a fear born of too many hours alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that these marks were more than coincidence. They weren't random. They were a message, a sign I was meant to see, and maybe, eventually, to understand. After that, I started counting the prints, tracking when and where they appeared. And the pattern held true. Always at the orphanage, always during the worst storms, always as if in answer to some silent summons from a place the world had chosen to forget. And in my bones, I felt that if I wanted peace, if I wanted the prints to stop, I'd have to find out why the children reached for the glass every time I passed them by. After a few weeks, the fear that first gripped me turned to a kind of grim fascination. I grew attuned to the rituals of those stormy nights, the change in the air pressure as I approached the orphanage, the hush that would fall inside the car, despite the roar of the storm outside, the faint static that crept onto the radio just before the handprints began to bloom across the glass. Each time, the ritual unfolded the same way, but with each new trip, the phenomenon escalated. It wasn't just the marks anymore. The car itself began to feel inhabited. It started as a feeling, a prickling on the back of my neck, a draft of air cold, as a cellar brushing across my shoulder from the back seat. I'd glance in the rear view, heart pounding, knowing I'd find nothing but darkness and the gleam of the casket's metal. Yet sometimes, just as the orphanage slipped past, I heard it, a soft, high giggle, too faint to be imagined, or a whisper so low and quick I thought it was the wind. But it came from inside the car, the susurrus of breath, the echo of laughter, the fleeting impression of tiny feet kicking against the floorboards. Once, as thunder boomed, I could have sworn I felt the seat behind me sink, as if a weight had briefly pressed into it before vanishing. After the third or fourth time, I stopped pretending it was just stress. The sadness in the air was too thick, the cold too physical, and the sounds, those faint, eager giggles and murmurs, always returned at the same spot, as if tied to that abandoned building's tragic legacy. I started dreading the storms, the route, the sensation of being a caretaker for cargo I never saw. Passengers who left no trace but wet, pleading handprints, and the electric thrum of sorrow in the marrow of my bones. One night, the whispers grew clearer. As I slowed by the orphanage, rain hammering so hard on the roof that the car vibrated, I heard a child's voice, small and clear, say, "Don't forget us." The rear window misted, and new handprints appeared as if on Q1 set, much smaller than the rest, pressed near the corner, as if a toddler had reached up from a low seat. The sadness was overwhelming, a grief that had nothing to do with my own life, but felt as intimate as my heartbeat. From that moment on, every time I passed the orphanage, I rolled down the radio and listened. There were always more whispers, sometimes laughter, sometimes a sob, sometimes just the quiet, mournful echo of little hands against glass. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside my car, a gathering of voices and longing that seemed to beg for attention, for witness, for release. I understood that I was carrying more than the dead in my car. I was also carrying memories, longing, and the restless need of lost children who wanted more than to haunt. They wanted to be remembered, wanted a voice, even if it was only in the shivering silence between lightning strikes. And with each passing, their presence grew stronger, more insistent, as if waiting for me to do something none of the living had ever done for them. To see them, to hear them, and finally, to let them go. Curiosity and exhaustion finally drove me to seek answers, despite the dread that trailed me every time I passed the orphanage gates. I needed to know why these children haunted my car, why their hands reached out of the storm, why the air inside my vehicle grew heavier with every trip. On a rare afternoon without rain, I parked near the ruined building, heart beating hard, and peered through a fence tangled with weeds and rusted wire. The windows gaped empty, the walls streaked with soot and graffiti, but beneath the vandalism I saw faded murals. Children in old-fashioned clothes, holding hands, eyes painted wide with hope or sorrow. I asked around town, stopping at the library and corner store, chasing rumors from anyone old enough to remember. Most people just shrugged and changed the subject. Others whispered warning stories of children gone missing, of a fire that swept through the orphanage on a stormy night decades ago, of bodies never found, and a director who vanished rather than face the police. One clerk pointed me to a crumbling book of town records and old newspapers, and in those yellowed pages I pieced together a nightmare. Dozens of orphans had died or disappeared between 1948 and 1961. Their graves, if any, were never marked. Some of the children had families who searched for years. Others were simply forgotten, their names lost along with the ashes and broken timbers. The storm that destroyed the orphanage was as fierce as any I'd driven through, but its aftermath was worse. The building was condemned, the few survivors relocated, the tragedy quickly swept away by the city's need to move on. The whispers of abuse, neglect, and shame never made it into the official accounts. No memorial was ever built. No priest ever consecrated the ground. The townspeople learned to avert their eyes as they passed the site, and in time, even the stories faded. But the children had not faded. Not for me, not for my car. Their hands, their voices, their laughter and longing, these were the living evidence of something left unfinished, a sorrow that refused to die in silence. As I read the list of missing children, their names leapt out at me. Sarah, Peter, Emma, Michael, Ruth. I recognized the names from the papers and felt a chill as I realized that, for as long as I had been driving past the orphanage during storms, there had always been 5 prints, sometimes more, sometimes less, but never none. It was as if their small hands were counting, each print a soul asking not to be erased. Armed with this knowledge, I knew what I had to do. The children were not angry. They were forgotten. They didn't want revenge. They wanted to be mourned, to be given what the city had denied them. A goodbye, a name spoken, a moment of peace. I resolved, as the next storm brewed on the horizon, to do what no one else had done for them in half a century, to acknowledge them, honor them, and try to help them rest at last. Because every mark, every whisper, every cold draft in my car had led to this point a chance to end the story with dignity, not despair. I waited for the next storm with a sense of purpose. The old dread transformed into a quiet responsibility. The forecast called for rain all night, thunder rattling the window panes even before I set out. This time, I was ready. In the passenger seat, I carried a handful of white wildflowers, gathered from the field behind my apartment. Simple, nameless blossoms, but alive and bright. In my pocket, I carried a cheap lighter and a page torn from my notebook. On it, I had written the names of the missing children. Each letter formed slowly, reverently, as if spelling their names could stitch them back into memory. The rain came down in thick sheets as I neared the orphanage, my headlights sweeping across the skeletal trees and the sagging roof, the windows black as old wounds. I slowed the car to a crawl and pulled over at the crumbling gates. The road was empty, but the air inside the car grew dense, humming with anticipation. On the inside of the glass, as if summoned by my intention alone, the handprints began to form 5, then 10, crowding the pane in frantic, delicate patterns. The whispering began too, a chorus of small, hopeful voices mingling with the sound of the storm. I stepped out into the downpour, clutching the flowers and the slip of paper, water soaking through my jacket in seconds. I walked up the cracked steps to what was left of the front entrance, heart pounding, breath visible in the cold. There, I laid the flowers on the threshold, struck a flame to the corner of the paper, and let it burn down in a small, trembling fire. As I watched the ashes spiral away, I whispered the children's names one last time, promising them that someone remembered, someone mourned, someone cared. Back in the car, I sat in silence, rain hammering the roof, eyes on the handprints still pressed against the glass. Slowly, almost gently, they faded away, each one dissolving until the windows were clear. The air lightened, the whispers ebbed into silence, and the oppressive cold in the car gave way to an almost imperceptible warmth, like a sigh of relief, or a child's hand squeezing mine before letting go. I drove the rest of my route that night with tears in my eyes, feeling lighter than I had in years. The storm eventually passed, the orphanage receded in the rearview, and I knew deep down, unmistakably, that the children had found some measure of peace. Never again did the handprints appear, not in rain, not in fog, not even in the darkest part of the night. But every time I passed that ruined building, I slowed, offered a silent prayer, and remembered the lesson those hands had left me, that no one, not even the forgotten, is truly gone if someone cares enough to remember. Story 9. It was the sort of night that funeral drivers dread, a darkness too thick, the air heavy with humidity that made the blacktop shine like the surface of a river. I was returning from a late run, exhausted, the world outside a swirl of shadows and fleeting headlights. The hearse was quiet, just the faint rattle of the suspension and the occasional hiss from the air vents. My mind blank with repetition and fatigue. The clock on the dash glowed 2:46 when the first chill ran through me, a tremor that made my fingers tighten around the wheel. The radio, which I never touched during these late shifts, sat silent. At exactly 2:47, it flickered on without warning. No static, no tuning, just the sudden swell of music, crisp and impossible to place. It wasn't on any preset. The volume seemed to set itself, neither too loud nor too soft, as if it knew how much my heart could stand. The song was old, but not in any way I recognized. It had the scratchy depth of a forgotten vinyl, the melody winding and sad, hints of waltz and lullaby tangled together in a tune that felt ancient and intimate. There were no words at first, only the sound of a woman humming, her voice warm and distant, sorrow stitched into every note. The hair on my arms lifted. I gripped the wheel, torn between pulling over and pretending nothing was wrong. The melody played out for nearly 3 minutes, unfurling over the steady rhythm of tires on asphalt, until the outside world seemed to recede entirely. In those moments, my breath came shallow, caught between fear and something like longing, a sense that I should know this music, that some part of me remembered it from a life before this one. When the song ended, the radio snapped off, as abrupt as a hand closing over a candle flame. The silence that followed was impossibly deep, every tick of the engine loud in my ears. I drove home in that quiet, the road blurring behind me, trying to shake off the feeling that something had shifted, not in the world, but in the air around me, inside me, as if an old wound had been pressed and left open. The next night, I tried to ignore the clock, but when 2:47 came, the radio came alive again, that same impossible melody spinning out of the static. I tried to change the station, to turn the dial, to kill the power, but the controls were dead under my hand. The car seemed to lock itself in place, lights dimmed, engine slowed, and all I could do was sit and listen, heart pounding, as the music played from a world I could not enter and could not escape. By the third night, I stopped fighting. I waited. I listened. Each note seemed heavier, and I sensed, though I could never prove, that the melody was somehow changing, adapting, echoing something I carried, something I'd lost. And after the song, always the same silence, like the world holding its breath, as if waiting for what would come next. But I could not yet know what came next. I only knew that at 2:47, I would hear the same song every night, whether I was ready or not. And each night, I wondered what would happen if I ever managed to remember the words. On the fourth night, I wasn't just waiting, I was bracing myself, the way you might before a storm you know is about to break. The clock ticked toward 2:47, the hearse gliding along empty streets, headlights slicing the dark. I barely noticed the city drifting by. All my attention was on the radio, on the hush of the cabin, on the tension building behind my ribs. When the clock flicked over, the radio awoke instantly, the music pouring into the silence with that same haunting, untraceable melody. My skin prickled. The notes curled around me, sad and beautiful, as if the song itself was some kind of prayer for everything left unsaid. But this time, when the music faded, the radio didn't snap off. Instead, a thin layer of static filled the air, like the soft hiss of old tapes or the quiet at the end of a midnight broadcast. Then, layered beneath it, something else so faint at first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of nerves and exhaustion. But the sound grew clearer, emerging out of the hum. Voices, whispering, dozens of them, overlapping, weaving in and out of the static like a secret chorus. They spoke names. At first, I couldn't catch them, just syllables tumbling after one another, some sharp, some slow and drawn out, as if the speakers had to reach through water or earth to say them. The effect was both chilling and oddly gentle. I recognized a few the Johnson boy, whose mother hadn't made it to the service. Old Mrs. Hanley, gone with only me and the priest for company. A man I'd ferried just last week, the memory of his wedding ring still vivid in my mind. With each name came a soft echo, a weight pressing briefly against my chest, a plea, not for rescue, but for remembrance. Then, softer still, barely audible over the static and the dwindling notes of the song, came a phrase, repeated in different voices, some cracked with age, some still young and hopeful. Don't forget me. Don't let me disappear. It wasn't a threat. There was no menace, only the quiet, desperate longing of people who had slipped out of life's reach, but not yet out of memory. The radio finally clicked off, leaving the car in a silence so total it seemed unnatural. I felt hollowed out, as if the names had been carved into me, and for a long moment I just sat there, unable to start the engine again, staring into the darkness as the world slowly came back. After that, I began to dread 2:47, not because of the fear, but because of the responsibility. Each night, new names joined the whispers, always those I'd transported in the last week, always people who had left the world quietly, their stories small and easily overlooked. The whispers never threatened. They only asked, "Remember me. Speak my name. Don't let me vanish." And so the music became a kind of ritual, the hour between day and night when the boundary thinned and those who had passed on returned, not for vengeance or comfort, but simply to ask that their lives not dissolve into nothing. Each time the song played, I listened for the names, and each time the whispers faded, I felt more bound to them, as if I had been given custody of their memories. One last passenger, one last favor, before the road could take me home. After a week of sleepless nights, my fear morphed into a restless obsession. The song haunted me long after it ended, its melody looping in my mind, its echoes following me through the silent halls of the funeral home and into my uneasy dreams. The whispers, too, pressed against my thoughts, a growing roster of names I couldn't allow myself to forget. I tried, in my waking hours, to rationalize the experience. I took the hearse to the shop, claiming issues with the wiring, but the mechanic found nothing wrong. I updated the radio, wiped all the presets, even drove with the fuse pulled, but at 2:47, the melody always returned, slipping past technology and reason, as if the car itself were simply a vessel for something older, something that cared little for buttons or fuses. The compulsion to understand drove me to start recording the broadcasts. I set my phone on the dash, voice memo app ready, determined to capture the song, to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. Each night, I'd listen to the playback, hoping to isolate the melody or parse the voices in the static. But every time I listened, the file was blank 3 minutes of digital silence, sometimes interrupted by a faint, unplaceable hiss that could have been the rain or my own breath. It was as if the song refused to exist outside of that hour, that place, that car. The search for the song's origin became a compulsion. I called local stations, humming the tune to disbelieving night DJs. I pored over forums about haunted radios and ghostly broadcasts, looking for a match, anything, anywhere. No one had heard it before. It wasn't on any playlist, not in the funeral home's library of hymns, or in the old records the director kept in the back office. Even the style of the recording was uncanny. Not quite jazz, not quite lullaby, its lyrics forever just out of reach. It felt like a melody plucked from the edge of memory, a song you only hear in dreams or just before waking. The voices in the static grew bolder as the week wore on. Sometimes the whispers would linger for a full minute after the music faded, naming not only the most recent passengers, but reaching deeper names from older logs, people I'd driven months ago, even years past. There were names I didn't recognize at all, spoken in accents and inflections that felt foreign but achingly intimate. Each name was a weight, a reminder of the quiet cargo I'd carried, their stories flickering through my mind in flashes. The way a child's toy rattled in the back, the faded photograph clutched in a widow's hands, the scent of lily or whiskey or rain-soaked wool. With every repetition, my sense of responsibility deepened. It became impossible to see the hour as anything but sacred, an appointment with the forgotten, a roll call for the lost. My fear had faded, replaced by a gnawing worry that if I ever stopped listening, the names would truly disappear, consigned forever to silence. The hearse felt heavier with every trip, the weight not of bodies, but of memories, stories, and silent pleas. The song, the whispers, the relentless hour, these became a covenant, unasked for but impossible to ignore, demanding that I remember what the world so easily left behind. And though exhaustion gnawed at me, and my friends began to notice the shadows under my eyes, I could not break the cycle. Every night at 2:47, I drove and I listened, desperate for answers, but finding only new names, new stories, and the growing sense that the song would continue until I found the way to honor the voices that filled the empty spaces of my life. By the second week, the line between ritual and compulsion had fully blurred. I began to carry a notebook with me in the hearse, leaving it open on the passenger seat as a silent pledge. Every time the music started, I would rest my hand over the paper, pen ready, heart braced for whatever names might be carried in on the midnight air. It wasn't just a coping mechanism anymore. It was a necessity, a small act of defiance against oblivion. If the world wouldn't remember these souls, I would. It was the least I could do, the only thing that made the haunting bearable. The song grew stranger each night, notes shifting slightly, like a dream changing as you try to recall it. Sometimes, just before the whispers began, I thought I could hear faint words in the music fragments of longing, hints of farewell or regret. As the melody faded, the names came, now spoken more clearly, always accompanied by that soft, desperate phrase, "Don't let me disappear." On nights when I recognized the names' families with no mourners, people whose funerals were attended only by the staff and a tired preacher, the sadness was almost too much to bear. I realized that some names were repeated, night after night, until I wrote them down or whispered them aloud in the dark. When I did, they seldom returned. It was as if acknowledgement, being seen, even by a stranger, granted them a kind of passage, however temporary, out of the shadow. Other names were unfamiliar, people who must have been brought in by colleagues or whose records were lost to time. I would jot them down anyway, honoring the rhythm of the request, adding their names to my growing list. With every page filled, the weight on my chest grew lighter and heavier at once. There was comfort in the act, but also a deepening sense of responsibility, as though I had become a caretaker, not just of bodies, but of stories each name a tiny lifeline thrown across the gulf of forgetting. One particularly stormy night, as the song faded and the voices gathered in a hush, I felt something shift in the air. The names came more slowly, as if each one was being handed to me, entrusted to my care. The final whisper was softer than all the rest, a child's voice from far away. "Thank you for remembering." For a moment, the cabin filled with warmth, a sense of peace so deep I almost wept. Then, as always, the static ended and the radio went dead. The next night, for the first time, the music didn't play at 2:47. I sat in silence, heart pounding, waiting for a melody that never came. I looked at my notebook, the names lined up in neat rows, and wondered if I'd done enough. If my small, imperfect gesture had been enough to answer the plea at the heart of every whisper, to not be forgotten, to be carried just a little farther down the road, safe from the silence a while longer. But I knew, as surely as I knew my own name, that I could never close the notebook. There would always be more voices, more stories, more pleas. And so I drove on into the night, a hearse full of memories, the song now humming quietly in my own heart, a ritual and a promise to the forgotten and the lonely. I will remember. You will not vanish while I am here. The notebook, now filled with page after page of names, each one a story, a face, a fragment of memory, became my nightly companion, a silent ledger of the lives I was entrusted to recall. Some nights, I would reread the names before my shift, speaking them softly into the darkness of the hearse, letting them echo for a moment before the world swallowed them again. I didn't know if it mattered. I only knew that, after so many nights of music and whispers, I could not go back to pretending the dead simply vanished. They needed to be remembered, and I had been chosen accidentally, perhaps, but chosen all the same. The night everything changed was colder than most, with a thin frost glazing the road and a pale fog curling low over the cemetery gates. The clock on the dash glowed 2:46. The notebook open beside me, pen uncapped and ready. I was prepared for the song, the voices, the routine that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. At exactly 2:47, the radio clicked on one final time. The melody was different now, slower, almost triumphant, woven through with a kind of sorrowful peace. I listened with my eyes closed, feeling the weight of all the nights before pressing gently on my shoulders. When the music faded, the static returned, but the whispers did not come. Instead, a single voice, warm and clear, filled the car. You remembered. Then, just beneath it, others joined in, each voice layered over the next, no longer desperate or pleading, but grateful. They spoke my name too, and for a moment I felt both seen and blessed, as if all the gratitude and sorrow of the forgotten dead had become a shield around me. Then the radio went silent utterly, impossibly silent, with no lingering static, no phantom song. The air in the hearse felt lighter, as if the burden had finally lifted, and a warmth spread through the cabin that had nothing to do with the old heater humming at my feet. I sat there for a long time, tears stinging my eyes, unsure if I was mourning or celebrating or simply relieved. The notebook glowed softly under the dome light, every name a star in the darkness. From that night on, the radio never again played the song at 2:47. The hour passed like any other. There were still funerals, still lonely roads and silent rides, but the sense of unfinished business was gone. I kept the notebook in my glove box, a quiet promise never to forget, and sometimes, when the night felt particularly empty, I would read the names again, letting them fill the silence. In the end, that was all they had asked for, not rescue, not justice, just remembrance. And in the gentle hush that followed, I understood that I had been changed as much as the voices I had served. For as long as I drove the night shift, I listened for the song, half hoping it would return, but it never did. In its absence, I found a new kind of peace, a silence not of neglect, but acceptance, the closing of a circle. I was the keeper of the last song, and I would remember for them, for myself, and for anyone who feared being lost to the darkness forever. Story 10. There are certain details you learn to overlook when you work nights at a cemetery. The kind of strangeness that comes with the territory. A sense of déjà vu on the winding roads. The way fog creeps between the stones before sunrise. The hush that clings to the parking lot at the far edge of midnight. But lately, those details had begun to sharpen around me, drawing into patterns I couldn't explain. It started with little things colleagues from the late shift, shaking off their raincoats, asking if I'd gotten everything ready so early. They'd nod as if we'd already talked, or hand me paperwork I was supposed to have started, joking about how I was always first to arrive. I'd laugh along, but the truth was, I hadn't set foot on the grounds until just before my scheduled time. I'd barely had time to gulp down coffee, let alone organize anything. The unease grew when I realized it wasn't just once or twice. Every few days, someone would insist they'd seen me alone by the service entrance, unlocking the main gate, or walking between the silent lines of graves as the sky went from purple to gray. The most unnerving detail was their certainty. You waved at me, man. You were by the crypt, about to open the back door. Or, you dropped your hat, remember? I saw you pick it up. They'd recount these moments with such clarity that I found myself doubting my own memory. At first, I told myself it was just the exhaustion night shifts, blending together, faces and times blurring at the edges. Maybe I really had arrived early, a few times, and just forgot. Maybe I'd wandered the grounds in a sleepy daze. But that didn't explain the missing time. I began to keep track, jotting down my routine in a little notebook, recording the exact time I entered the lot, which pocket I put my keys in, what music played on the drive-in. But my entries never matched the stories my coworkers told. Worse, some nights I would find items out of place, my flashlight left on in the supply closet, a set of muddy boots lined up at my locker, a clipboard with fresh notes in my handwriting that I didn't recall writing. I'd ask around, but no one admitted moving anything. Sometimes, as I prepared to clock in, I'd get a flash of sensation, like having just woken from a vivid dream. The echo of footsteps on gravel or the snap of a gate latch, details too clear to be invented. The feeling of living in two versions of the same day grew impossible to ignore. Sometimes, I'd catch my reflection in the window and not quite recognize the face staring back drawn, pale, haunted by the nagging suspicion that some other me was wandering the cemetery while I slept or worked elsewhere. My days began to unravel at the seams. I'd wake up feeling drained, half convinced I'd spent the night walking the rows of headstones instead of sleeping at home. My friends noticed too. They'd say I looked tired, distracted, like I was only half there. The final straw came on a cold Monday morning after a long, rain-soaked weekend. I arrived just before sunrise, bleary-eyed and shivering, only to find the office coffee already brewing and a neat stack of paperwork labeled with my name. When I asked who'd started the pot, the groundskeeper grinned. "You did," he said. "You were here before all of us out by the road, just standing there, like you were waiting for someone." His certainty sent a chill through me, deeper than the November wind. I could no longer dismiss these gaps as mere forgetfulness. There was a presence in my life, an echo, a shadow, something moving just ahead or behind me, repeating actions I couldn't recall. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind, or if in a place as heavy with history as a cemetery, it was possible for time itself to bend, to trap a person in loops and repetitions they couldn't escape. But the worst part wasn't the fear of madness. It was the slow, knowing realization that, perhaps, I wasn't living my days alone, that another version of me, a version shaped by loss or regret, might be out there, reliving a story I'd tried to forget, waiting for me to finally notice. It wasn't long before the unease turned to outright anxiety. Each night, the evidence of some unremembered life multiplied. My keys found in the wrong pocket, a jacket draped on the back of the wrong chair, the radio set to a station I never listened to. Sometimes I would climb into the hearse after clocking in, only to find the seat adjusted all the way back, the mirrors tilted toward the roof, as if someone taller, or simply someone else, had been behind the wheel. My phone would show missed calls I didn't remember, or texts sent at hours when I was supposed to be asleep. One morning, I woke to find my boots muddy, though the night before I'd left them clean by the door. I began to question my own reality. Each new lapse seemed to hollow out another piece of my day, until I wasn't sure where my memories ended and the stories of others began. The sensation of déjà vu grew constant. I would drive down certain streets on the way to work and feel a jolt of recognition, like I had just passed by, only to realize I'd never taken that route before. A coffee mug left half-finished on the counter, a half-eaten sandwich in the fridge. These became the daily reminders that some other version of myself was living parallel to me, just out of sight. The strangeness only deepened at work. Colleagues began to act oddly around me, as if unsure how to approach. Sometimes I'd catch them glancing at me, then quickly away, like I was a stranger whose name they couldn't quite place. One even called me by a different name just once, quietly, before catching himself and apologizing. Others swore I'd covered their shifts the previous week, or thanked me for rides I never gave. On more than one occasion, I'd enter the break room and find everyone silent, looking at me as if I'd just returned from the grave. The oddest moments came when I found myself somewhere I couldn't remember going. Once, I woke up in the hearse, engine idling softly, parked in front of an old church miles away from the cemetery. The dashboard clock read 4:12 a.m. Had no memory of driving there, no idea why I'd left home in the first place. Another time, I opened my locker to find a funeral program tucked into my coat pocket, dated years before I'd started the job. The name on the program gave me a chill, a distant relative, long dead, whose face I remembered from a childhood photograph. At home, I started keeping a journal, trying to map out every detail of my days and nights, but the entries only highlighted the gaps. Sometimes I'd find my own handwriting trailing off mid-sentence, as if I'd simply disappeared for hours at a time. I started to wonder if I was forgetting more than I realized, if there were whole stretches of time lost to these blackouts, time in which another self walked and worked and remembered things I could not. The sense of invisibility grew. Colleagues, when asked, seemed unsure of when I'd last been seen. Once, a friend passed me on the street, eyes blank, and didn't respond when I called his name later. He insisted he hadn't seen me at all. It was as if I was fading out of their memory, becoming a ghost in my own life, a figure glimpsed only in the periphery. I could feel something drawing me back to the grounds, to the long corridors of headstones, to places that seemed to remember me better than people did. My nights became a patchwork of partial memories and repeated scenes, as if I were following a script written long ago. And always, beneath the confusion, there was a growing certainty. I was not alone in this. The story was not only mine. There were other shadows at the edge of memory, faces glimpsed in mirrors and windows. waiting for me to remember who we were and why we could not move on. The sense of not being alone in my own life grew stronger with each passing night. It was more than just misplaced objects or confused glances from colleagues. It was a feeling that every path I took, every quiet hallway, every rain-damp stretch of road was layered with echoes. Shadows moved just out of reach. Reflections lingered a second too long. I'd catch my own face in the glass and see a flicker of someone older or more tired, or simply not me. It was enough to make anyone question their sanity. But after the last blackout, when I awoke slumped in the hearse, parked at the far edge of the cemetery, I knew I had to find out the truth, no matter how unsettling it might be. I started with the basics: old employee logs, the shift rotation spreadsheets, decades of yellowed notes stuffed into file cabinets in the break room. At first, nothing made sense, just years of turnover, long lists of names, the casual bureaucratic churn of a place devoted to endings. But the more I dug, the more I noticed certain patterns. Names repeating over the years, initials scrawled in the margins, the same handwriting cropping up in logs supposedly written years apart. There was even an old photo, tucked behind a bulletin board, showing a group of drivers in black suits and caps, standing in front of a hearse, so old it could have been from another century. One of the faces looked uncannily like me, same eyes, same lopsided smile, though I'd never seen the picture before. It was when I started asking the real old-timers, the groundskeepers who'd worked there since before the digital age, that I finally got a lead. One of them, a man named Carl, had sharp eyes and a memory as precise as a metronome. He listened quietly as I described my lapses, my strange arrivals, the things I didn't remember. Then he nodded slowly and told me, in a voice so soft I had to lean in to hear, about an accident. Years ago, no one was sure exactly when a driver on the night shift had lost control on the curve just past the southern gate. Rain, faulty brakes, bad luck. The hearse had crashed, flipping into the drainage ditch. The coffin in the back splintered, the driver thrown through the windshield. The funeral was quiet. They never did fix that curve right, Carl said. Sometimes I think we're all just waiting for it to happen again. A cold certainty settled in my bones. I spent the next few nights combing the archives, piecing together details, old newspaper clippings, faded death certificates, employee rosters with certain names scratched out. The accident had happened more than once, it seemed, or at least the story had been told that way. Drivers vanishing, routes repeating, time folding over itself. The official records were vague, but the unofficial ones, the rumors, the stories whispered at the end of the shift, were clear. No one ever really left this place. Some of us just forgot how we got here. One log entry, dated decades before, chilled me to the core. It read, "Lost another driver tonight. Same time, same place. He'll be back. They always come back." My own name wasn't there, of course. Or maybe it was, written under a different year, a different face, a different set of initials. But as I stared at the looping, familiar script, I realized it didn't matter. The story was always the same. A driver, a crash, a memory lost and found and lost again. I could feel the truth gathering at the edge of my mind, a storm about to break. If I wanted answers, if I wanted to find out who I was and why the world was forgetting me, I would have to follow the path to its end, even if it meant meeting myself somewhere along the way. After the revelation of the accident, the restlessness inside me became unbearable. Nights and days lost all distinction. I felt as if I was drifting between layers of reality, sometimes solid, sometimes only a memory passing through the world of the living. My dreams grew vivid and labyrinthine. I would see headlights spinning across rain-soaked pavement, a hearse door swinging open to a road that had no end, shadows slipping into the passenger seat, faces in the rearview mirror, both familiar and impossibly strange. There were moments when I was sure I heard voices in the static of the radio, calling my name, urging me onward, promising understanding if I just kept driving through the dark. It was during one of these blackouts, the deepest yet, that I found myself not on the familiar roads of my small town, but in a place that seemed carved out of memory and mist. The world was neither fully day nor night. The air hummed with the distant sound of engines idling, radios whispering static, footsteps moving in circles over gravel. I was still in my uniform, still holding the keys to the hearse. But the cemetery was larger than any I'd ever seen. Endless rows of headstones fading into the gray, winding drives and hidden corners, all shrouded in a low, rolling fog. I wandered, disoriented, until I saw them. Other drivers dressed like me, wandering the roads in silence or sitting on the bumpers of their long, black cars. Some greeted me with a nod. Others stared right through me, as if I were just another ghost. I recognized a few faces from old photographs and company records. One man had askew, nodded at me and murmured, "First time in the between?" Another, an elderly woman with sharp, sad eyes, handed me a funeral program. The name on the front faded to nothing. I realized then that I wasn't the only one lost in this endless route, this repetition of memory and regret. Some drivers spoke in fragments, unable to recall their own names or how long they had been here. Others clung to old routines, washing their cars, adjusting mirrors, double-checking their logbooks habits that tethered them to something solid. A few told their stories in quiet voices, accidents, missed turns, moments when the road simply ended, and they were left circling this foggy afterworld, forgotten by the living, but unable to forget themselves. I understood, with a sense of mournful kinship, that all of us had been pulled here by the same unresolved ending. A crash, a secret, a life left unfinished. I heard snatches of my own story in their words, as if we were fragments of a single accident, repeating across the years. There was comfort in their presence, a feeling that I was not alone in this limbo, that my confusion and longing were part of a larger tapestry of loss. Somewhere in that endless cemetery, a light beckoned. The others watched as I moved toward it, encouraging me to seek the truth, to find the moment that had kept me tethered, lost, and circling. One man gripped my shoulder as I passed and whispered, "You don't have to drive alone anymore. We're all waiting for the same peace." Their words gave me courage. As the fog parted and the world grew bright and sharp, I understood that my story and theirs could not end until we faced the crash. A moment when we left the world behind, but could not let it go. I was ready at last to meet my own ending, to let the past go, and perhaps, just perhaps, help others do the same. There is a moment, somewhere between acceptance and surrender, where the past becomes clear, and the present finally loosens its grip. As I followed that pale, beckoning light through the foggy lanes of the cemetery between worlds, memories flooded back with a clarity that was as painful as it was liberating. The steering wheel slicked beneath my hands, the rain hammering down, the headlights scattering across the curve too fast to correct, the jolt of terror as the hearse spun out, my hands clutching at the air, a name on my lips that I'd forgotten for years. I remembered the silence that followed, the cold water rising around me in the ditch, the world outside already moving on, the paperwork filed, the shift covered by someone else. My life paused at the point of impact, waiting for permission to continue. I saw the other drivers waiting by their vehicles, watching, silent witnesses to my own confrontation. I understood, in a way deeper than words, that we were all stuck at this same intersection, a last stop before the journey could truly end. Some had been there for years, others for moments that felt like lifetimes, each of us tethered by regret, unfinished business, or the simple fear of being forgotten by the world we'd left behind. But now, surrounded by these kindred spirits, I saw how memory, no matter how fractured or painful, could become a bridge, not an anchor. I remembered every name called by a colleague, every story half told at the end of a shift, every kindness given and received in the dead hours before dawn. And in that moment, I felt gratitude rather than sorrow. It was as if the fog itself had weight, and my recognition, my willingness to see my own story to its end, lifted it at last. A warmth spread through me, slow but certain, The world around me shifted. The cemetery faded. The other drivers began to move, finding their own roads, their own release. One by one, I watched as they turned and vanished into the growing light, the burden of memory dissolving with them. I felt a gentle pressure on my shoulder, a silent encouragement. It's time. At the end of the lane, I turned back for a final look. The hearse stood ready, clean and empty, waiting for no one. My reflection, clear and untroubled in the glass, smiled back at me, not the haunted, uncertain man I'd become, but someone at peace with his own ending. I understood now that I was never truly forgotten, nor ever truly alone. Our stories remained, woven into the fabric of the place, honored and remembered as long as someone cared enough to seek the truth. When I stepped into the dawn, the cold lifted, the sky softened, and the weight of endless repetition fell away. I knew that others would still arrive, that new drivers would wander these roads and wonder at the strange tricks of time and memory, but they would not walk alone. I left a message for them, one final entry in the logbook, a reminder that even the lost can find their way, and even those whom no one remembers can choose, at last, to move on. And as the world of the living quietly reclaimed its rhythm, I understood that I was part of something larger, a story of endings, of recognition, of the peace that comes when we finally accept what we are and let go. The road ahead was empty, but I was not afraid. I drove onward into the light, no longer a ghost in my own life, but simply a man who had learned to remember and so found a way to rest.